There is a particular kind of quiet that belongs only to the North Atlantic at 3 in the morning, somewhere between Iceland and the coast of Nova Scotia, in the middle of a war that the world has not yet decided. Not a comfortable quiet, not the quiet of rest or of peace. It is the quiet of everything being held very still, of men trying not to breathe too loudly, of ears straining for something they cannot name, but would absolutely recognize. It is the quiet of a steel hull, no wider than a pair of suburban streets, laid end to end, moving at roughly 28 knots through black water, in complete darkness, surrounded by nearly 200 human beings who have each, in their own private way, already made a kind of peace with not coming home.
Welcome.
Settle in. This is the story of the Atlantic War, not as admirals recorded it, not as newspapers printed it, but as it was actually lived in the cold and the dark by the men aboard the Royal Navy destroyers. This is what it was really like. There is something historians argue over, quietly, in footnotes and conference rooms, that rarely makes it into the popular telling of the Second World War at sea. The debate runs something like this. Was the Battle of the Atlantic one campaign? Or was it several overlapping ones, each with its own character, its own technology, its own particular flavor of desperation? The short answer is both, which is unhelpful but accurate. What the argument confirms is that the Atlantic War was not a single dramatic event. It was an endurance contest that stretched from the 3rd of September, 1939, to the last weeks of April, 1945, nearly 6 full years. And throughout those years, the men who carried the weight of it were, more than anyone else, the crews of the Royal Navy's destroyers. Not the submarine hunters in the headlines. Not the battleships with their 16-inch gun turrets, the destroyers. The long, lean, exhausted ships that were always somewhere in between, always doing 3 jobs at once, always needed somewhere else. This is their story, and it begins not with glory, but with a ship, and with a man trying to find somewhere to sleep. If you have found this video at the end of a long day, if you are lying in the dark with the window cracked, trying to let the weight of the ordinary world fall away, then there is something fitting about that, because the men aboard these ships spent the better part of 6 years doing exactly that, trying to find, in the margins of an impossibly demanding routine, a few hours of something resembling rest. They did not always succeed, but they kept going anyway. That is the thread we will follow tonight. Not tactics, not geopolitics, not the machinery of grand strategy, though those things will appear because they must. Tonight we follow the human thread. The man on the bridge at 0200 hours, the rating hunched over a cold tin mug in the mess, the Aztec operator who has been staring at a dial for 4 hours and is starting to see patterns in static. We follow them across the full arc of the Atlantic War. From the chaotic first months of 1939, when the Royal Navy discovered with some horror that it was not remotely prepared for what Germany was doing beneath the waves, all the way to the strange, almost surreal quiet of 1945, when the U-boats finally stopped coming. If you stay with this film, and I hope you do, you will hear things that no official history quite captures. You will hear what the food tasted like after 4 days in heavy seas. You will hear what a destroyer's hull does in a force 10 gale, the sounds it makes, the angles it reaches, the way a man must brace himself in his hammock or risk being deposited on the deck. You will hear about the Aztec gear, which was the Royal Navy's best tool for finding submarines, and which was, by several documented accounts, deeply imperfect in ways that the Admiralty took some time to fully acknowledge. You will hear about watch systems and rank structures, about the strange democratic intimacy that a small warship enforces on its crew, and about the moments, and there were many, when the job asked more of a man than any job has a right to ask. Stay with us. There is a long night ahead, and the convoy is not yet safe. Chapter 1. The Ship and What She Was. Before a single man sets foot on a Royal Navy destroyer, it is worth understanding what kind of machine he is stepping onto. Because the destroyer, more than almost any other warship of the Second World War, tells you something fundamental about the nature of the conflict it was built to fight. It is not a beautiful ship, not in the way that a battle cruiser is beautiful. It is functional in the way a good working knife is functional. Nothing wasted, nothing decorative, everything in service of a purpose. A typical fleet destroyer of the wartime Royal Navy displaced somewhere between 1,300 and 2,500 tons. The exact figure depending heavily on which class you were aboard and how fully loaded she was, and measured roughly 100 to 120 meters from bow to stern. Put that in more immediate terms. It is a vessel about the length of a football pitch, containing everything needed to sustain nearly 200 men at sea for weeks at a time, plus the weapons, the sensors, the machinery, and the fuel, to hunt submarines and fight surface engagements in some of the most violent waters on Earth. The available space per man was not generous. It never was. The Royal Navy entered the war in September 1939 with a collection of destroyer classes that reflected about 2 decades of evolving thought on what a destroyer should do. There were the pre-war fleet destroyers, the J-class, the K-class, the N-class, balanced designs that could escort capital ships or operate independently, equipped with 4.7-inch guns and torpedo tubes for surface work, and ASDIC equipment for the submarine hunt. There were the older ships, some dating to the latter years of the First World War, pressed back into service because the numbers were not there without them. And there were the town-class ships, 50 aging American destroyers, transferred from the United States Navy under an agreement signed in September 1940, refitted at British yards and handed to Royal Navy crews, who received them with a mixture of gratitude and frank concern. They were old. Some had not been to sea in years. Several were structurally questionable. But they were ships, and in 1940, ships were what Britain desperately needed. The men who sailed them made of this situation what they could. The hull of a wartime destroyer was thin, not dangerously thin in the engineering sense. These were not negligently built vessels, but thin in the way that reminds a crew, constantly and without sentiment, that the ocean is not a forgiving environment, and that the steel between them, and it is measured in millimeters rather than inches. Sailors who served on destroyers sometimes spoke of hearing the sea directly through the hull plating, particularly forward, where the motion in heavy weather was most pronounced. Below decks, in the forward mess spaces where junior ratings lived and slept, the sounds of the ocean were intimate in ways that no amount of naval training quite prepared you for. The ship would pitch into a wave, and the hull would shudder. A full body shudder that transmitted itself through every bulkhead, every bunk frame, every loose fitting, and then recover and pitch again. It was continuous. It was the constant background condition of life at sea on a small warship. And men either learned to sleep through it, or they did not sleep. The weapons fit of a typical Atlantic destroyer tells you, almost at a glance, what the ship was expected to do. The main gun armament, 4.7-inch guns on the fleet destroyers, 4-inch guns on the escort variants, handled surface threats, and provided the option of shore bombardment during amphibious operations. The torpedo tubes, typically arranged in two quadruple mounts amidships, were the destroyer's heavy punch against enemy surface vessels, fast, powerful, and requiring the ship to close to ranges that made the crew acutely aware of their lack of armor. But in the Atlantic, the weapon that defined the destroyer's working life was neither the gun nor the torpedo. It was the depth charge, a steel canister packed with high explosive, dropped or thrown from the stern and the sides, set to detonate at a pre-calculated depth. The depth charge was the answer to the U-boat. Imprecise, brutally physical in its effect on everyone within range, and absolutely indispensable. In the early years of the war, before better systems arrived, it was essentially the only answer. A destroyer's stern would carry racks of them, and on the hunt, the crew would roll them into the water one after another, while the ASDIC operator maintained his contact, and the captain tried to place the ship exactly where the geometry of the problem said the submarine would be. The bridge, the open bridge, in the early war destroyers, was the point from which all of this was directed. And it deserves a moment's consideration because it was not what a landlocked imagination would necessarily picture. It was exposed. Entirely, uncompromisingly exposed to the elements. The wind, the spray, the rain, the spray again. A canvas windbreak provided something. A duffel coat and a pair of good sea boots provided something else. But the commanding officer of a destroyer at sea in the North Atlantic in January was standing in the open air, in all weathers, in a moving, rolling, pitching ship, trying to process information from multiple sources and make time-critical decisions. Later classes acquired enclosed bridges, and later officers sometimes remarked on the difference this made, not just in terms of physical comfort, but in terms of how long a man could remain effective before the weather began to degrade his ability to think. The open bridge was a demanding environment. It produced a specific kind of officer, one who had learned, of necessity, to function in conditions that would stop most people thinking clearly. The engine room, below all of this, below the waterline, on a ship that was already not large, was a world of its own. Two sets of geared turbines, producing enough shaft horsepower to drive the ship to speeds approaching 32 or 33 knots under ideal conditions, were maintained by an engineering department that lived and worked in an environment of heat, noise, and mechanical complexity that the upper decks rarely thought much about. In heavy weather, the engineering spaces moved in ways that the bridge could feel abstractly, but that the stokers and artificers experienced directly. Their workspace, tilting the machinery around them, vibrating in frequencies that changed with the ship's speed and the sea state. The boilers required constant attention. The turbines required constant attention. The shafts required constant attention. There was no autopilot for the engine room. There were men, and there was the job, and the two remained in continuous relationship for as long as the ship was underway, which in the Atlantic War was very nearly always. What this ship required, in total, was between 150 and 250 men. The exact complement, varying by class and fit, and the wartime figures were sometimes significantly higher than the peacetime design had anticipated, because the war kept adding equipment, and the equipment needed operators. Those men were arranged into a hierarchy that had been developing since before the age of sail. Commissioned officers at the top, warrant officers and senior rates below them, the ordinary seamen and stokers and signalmen and cooks and stewards making up the bulk of the crew. On a ship of this size, the hierarchy was simultaneously more visible and more human than it was on a battleship or a cruiser. You could not avoid your captain. He could not avoid you. The ship was too small for the comfortable distances that rank maintained on larger vessels, and this had consequences, sometimes positive, sometimes not, that shaped the character of every destroyer in ways that are worth understanding before the story properly begins. Chapter 2. Who these men were. In the autumn of 1939, the Royal Navy was expanding at a rate it had never experienced before, and was not, in any honest administrative sense, prepared for. The peacetime Navy had been built on professional continuity. Men who joined as boys, who learned the trade over years, who absorbed the culture of the service through proximity and repetition, until it became second nature. That model did not survive contact with a war of this scale. The fleet needed men faster than the peacetime training pipeline could supply them, and so it drew on the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. Men who had served part-time in the interwar years, who had civilian jobs and civilian lives, and who now reported for full service, with varying degrees of readiness, and on the hostilities only ratings. Men who had no previous naval connection at all, who had been fishermen or dockers or clerks or farm labourers, and who were now going to be made into sailors in a matter of months. What the training establishments produced was, by any pre-war standard, imperfect. What the ships that received these men made of them, over months of actual sea service, was something else entirely. The officers of a wartime destroyer covered a similarly wide range of origin and preparation. The regular Royal Navy officer, trained at Dartmouth, commissioned through the peacetime system, shaped by years of service in a range of vessels, was increasingly a minority as the war progressed, and expansion demanded promotion faster than the system had been designed to allow. The Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve provided officers as well as ratings. Solicitors who could navigate, bank clerks who turned out to be excellent gunnery officers, school teachers who had sailed dinghies on weekends and discovered they had a gift for anti-submarine work. There are accounts in the published memoir literature of the RNVR officers having to overcome a certain institutional skepticism from the regular Navy, the wavy Navy, they were sometimes called, for the wavy gold braid that distinguished their sleeve rings from the straight rings of the regular service, and of that skepticism dissolving entirely after a convoy or two, when what mattered was not where a man had trained, but whether he could be relied upon at 0200 hours in deteriorating weather. Most could, some could not. The sea tends to sort this out with considerable efficiency. A destroyer's crew was also divided, physically and professionally, by their branch. The seamen who worked the guns and the torpedo tubes and the deck equipment. The communications ratings who handled the signal lamps, the radio, and the voice pipes that connected the bridge to the rest of the ship. The engineering department who maintained the machinery, the stokers who tended the boilers, the ASDIC operators who ran the submarine detection equipment, and the various specialist ratings, torpedo men, gunners' mates, medical personnel, who filled particular roles that the watch bill required. Each branch had its own subculture, its own professional pride, its own complaints about every other branch. This was not peculiar to destroyers. It was a feature of naval life generally. But on a small ship, it was expressed in closer quarters and with less opportunity for avoidance. A leading seaman who had opinions about the engineering department's maintenance of the deck gear would, sooner or later, have to share a mess table with someone from that department. The ship was that small. The average age of a wartime destroyer's crew was younger than any newspaper photograph quite conveys. The ratings were mostly in their late teens and early 20s. The officers were not much older. A sub-lieutenant might be 20, a first lieutenant 24 or 25, and captains of destroyers in their late 20s or early 30s were not unusual by the middle years of the war. This was in part a function of the naval promotion structure, which had always placed young men in positions of significant responsibility, and in part a function of attrition. Losses created vacancies, and vacancies created opportunities that would not have opened up in peacetime until a man was considerably older. What it meant in human terms was that the ship was run by young men, many of whom were making decisions of life or death consequence for the first time, with the specific and unrepeatable kind of confidence that only the very young can maintain in the face of deeply uncertain odds. Whether this was a strength or a vulnerability depended enormously on the individual and on the specific moment in question. The men came from everywhere in Britain and from beyond Britain as the war progressed, and the Dominions contributed their own personnel to the fleet. Canadian ratings served alongside British ones. Australian officers held commands. South Africans, New Zealanders, men from the Caribbean who had volunteered and made their way to British ports, stood watches and worked guns, and read ASDIC contacts in the north, Atlantic alongside men from Portsmouth and Liverpool and the Clyde. The historical record on this aspect of destroyer life is somewhat patchy. The Dominion contribution to the Atlantic War has been better documented in the Canadian naval histories than in the British ones, and there are genuine gaps in the picture that honest historians acknowledge. But the basic fact is clear. These crews were not homogeneous, and the small spaces of a destroyer forced encounters between men who would never, in any peacetime arrangement of the world, have stood next to each other. This was sometimes awkward. It was sometimes illuminating. It was always the reality. The men who survived the Atlantic War, and a significant number did not, carried the experience with them in ways that were rarely straightforward to express. The Battle of the Atlantic claimed, by the most reliable accounting, more than 30,000 Allied merchant mariners alone, and the warship casualties were substantial. Royal Navy destroyers were lost with some regularity. To U-boat torpedoes, to mines, to aircraft, to surface action, to the weather acting on already stressed hulls in extreme sea states. The names are there in the records: HMS Afridi, HMS Acasta, HMS Glowworm, ships that went down with significant portions of their crews, because the Atlantic was a very large ocean and rescue, when it came at all, came slowly. The men who knew this, who had seen ships in convoy torpedoed, and had watched the water for survivors, and had found some, and not found others, carried that knowledge quietly through the remainder of their service. It shaped them in ways that are very difficult to describe from the outside, and that the men themselves, in most of the accounts they left behind, described only obliquely. The indirect language of understatement, a distinctly British mode of expression that the Royal Navy had elevated almost to an art form, was in this context not evasiveness but precision, a way of indicating, to anyone who knew how to read it, that what lay beneath was not discussable in ordinary terms. The newest man on the ship arrived from his training establishment, perhaps 3 months ago, still learning the vocabulary, still finding his feet in heavy weather, was part of the same organization as the leading seaman who had been at sea for 6 years and who carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who has been tested and knows it. The ship made them colleagues, made them in the particular sense that wartime creates, something close to family. The relationship was not always warm, but it was real, and it was durable, and it was what made the whole thing work. Without it, none of what follows would have been possible. Chapter 3: The Rhythm of Watches. The most fundamental fact of life aboard a destroyer at sea, the fact from which everything else follows, is the watch system, and understanding it is essential to understanding anything else about how these men lived. A ship at sea must be operated continuously, around the clock, regardless of weather or fatigue, or what day of the week it happens to be. There is no closing time, no weekend, no holiday. The machinery does not pause. The ASDIC does not pause. The sea certainly does not pause. And so the crew is divided into watches, rotating groups, each responsible for running the ship for a defined period. And the watches cycle through without interruption for as long as the ship is underway. In the wartime Royal Navy, the standard arrangement was 3 watches, each watch keeping 4 hours on and 8 hours off, with the so-called dog watches in the late afternoon. The first dog watch from 1600 to 1800 hours, and the last dog watch from 1800 to 2000 hours, serving to rotate the schedule forward so that no watch kept the same hours 2 days running. It is elegant in a purely functional sense, and it is absolutely exhausting. The morning watch ran from 0400 to 0800 hours, from 4 in the morning until 8. This was, by general consensus among men who kept it for years, the hardest watch of the day, not because anything was more likely to happen in those hours. Operationally, the statistics did not bear that out, but because it arrived at the point in the night when the body's resistance to cold and fatigue was lowest, and the horizon was at its most deceptive. The watch officer on the open bridge of a destroyer at 5 in the morning in the North Atlantic was dealing with darkness giving way to a grey that was not quite daylight, a wind that had been building since midnight, a sea state that the overnight log recorded as force 7, but that felt, on the bridge, more than that, and a body that had been awake for what felt like a very long time. And that was being asked to remain alert to the possibility of a submarine, periscope, or a distress signal from somewhere in the convoy. This was the ordinary demand of the morning watch. It was not exceptional. It was just Tuesday. The middle watch, midnight to 0400, had its own character. The ship was as quiet as a ship underway ever gets. The off-watch men were in their hammocks, or attempting to be. The mess decks were dark and close and warm in a way that was all the more vivid for the contrast with what was happening outside the hull. A man coming off the middle watch at 4 in the morning would have been standing on a moving, spray-swept bridge in the dark for 4 hours, and the descent below decks into the smell and warmth of the mess was, by more than one account, one of the most powerful sensory experiences of a sailor's life. Not pleasurable, exactly, because there was nothing romantic about the smell of a wartime mess deck in mid-Atlantic, but warm, real, human in a way that the bridge was not. Within the watch structure, there were subdivisions and specific duties that kept men occupied, even when the broad conditions were quiet. The ASDIC operator rotated through his stints at the detector, listening for the echo that indicated a submerged contact, monitoring a piece of technology that was sophisticated for its era and imperfect in ways that were still being discovered and documented. The ASDIC, Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, which is what the name stood for before it became simply the word for the device, worked by emitting a pulse of sound into the water and measuring the return. When a submarine was present, the return came back at a different frequency and timing than the background, and the operator identified this by ear and by instrument. The problem, which the official histories of the Battle of the Atlantic eventually addressed with some candor, was that the sea itself generated returns from thermal layers in the water column, from schools of fish, from the turbulent water under the destroyer's own hull, that could, in the hands of an inexperienced operator, be read as submarine contacts. Training improved this, experience improved it further. But in the early years, the ASDIC was a tool of considerable power and significant uncertainty, and the men who operated it bore the weight of both. The signalmen on watch held their own particular vigil, reading and relaying the Aldous lamp signals that passed between ships of the convoy and the escort, the flag hoists that communicated speed changes and course alterations, the coded radio traffic that came down from Western Approach's command. A memoirist who served on HMS Zodiac, a destroyer on the Arctic run, noted that the Aldous lamp was used in conditions that tested the limits of human visual acuity. At night, in rain, across distances that asked a great deal of an already tired pair of eyes. The gramophone in the mess played when the ship was in harbour, but at sea the phonograph needle had a habit of skipping out of the record groove in heavy weather and skidding across the disc, and the music was therefore a luxury available only when the Atlantic permitted it. These details, minor, domestic, specific, are the kind that get omitted from operational histories, and that tell you more about actual life aboard than any tactical summary. The cook, who occupied a role on a destroyer that demanded both competence and a philosophical temperament, worked within a watch system of his own devising, producing 3 meals a day for a crew whose appetite was both genuine and dependent on the sea state. In calm weather, the galley was a busy and relatively straightforward operation. In heavy weather, the galley was a challenging environment in which every surface was moving, and hot liquid was a hazard, and the meals that emerged were often not meals that had been intended. The Royal Navy's catering tradition on small ships leaned heavily toward what was practical, caloric, and storable. Tinned goods, hardtack, preserved meat, strong tea in industrial quantities. Fresh food, when it was available after leaving harbour, diminished within the first few days and was replaced by the preserved alternatives. The tea did not diminish. The Royal Navy's relationship with tea bordered on the theological, and even the most chaotic convoy battle generated cups of tea at intervals that suggested the catering branch was running on a schedule independent of whatever the Germans were doing. The watch system also governed sleep, and sleep was the resource that destroyers were most consistently short of. 8 hours off watch sounds adequate, until you account for the time required to reach your hammock, the time required to eat, the time required to attend to personal maintenance in conditions where fresh water was rationed, and the bathroom spaces were shared by many men in a sequence that did not accommodate leisurely use, and the time taken by all the small administrative demands that ship life generates. 6 hours was a realistic estimate of available sleep time during a quiet transit. 4 hours was common during operations. And the hammock itself, slung above the mess table in a space where a dozen other men were also attempting to sleep in hammocks, slung at arm's length from one another, in a ship that was rolling continuously. The hammock was not rest in any civilian sense of the word. It was unconsciousness, intermittently achieved and gratefully received. And men who had been doing it for 2 years learned to achieve it with a speed and reliability that impressed those new to the ship, and that spoke to a depth of accumulated exhaustion that was simply the baseline condition of Atlantic service. Chapter 4. Living in the Mess. The mess deck on a Royal Navy destroyer was both the most lived-in space on the ship and the least likely to appear in any official photograph. It was where the non-officer ratings ate, slept, socialized, argued, and spent whatever time the watch system left them when they were not at their stations. It was, for most of a destroyer's crew, the primary human environment of the war, more real, in daily terms, than the bridge, the gun deck, or the ASDIC compartment. Understanding the mess is, in a sense, understanding the fundamental texture of what the war at sea actually felt like for the men who fought it. And the mess, by any objective description, was not comfortable. But it was human, and that distinction mattered more than the comfort. The physical space was defined by the mess table, a fixed table, bolted to the deck, surrounded by benches or folding seats, and the hammock stowage overhead, where the rolled canvas hammocks were stored during daylight hours and deployed at night. The men who used this space numbered anywhere from 8 to 12, depending on the ship and the era, sharing a table, sharing cooking utensils, sharing the small lockers that held their personal belongings. There was no privacy in any meaningful sense. A man's letters from home were written and received in a space where others were sitting within arm's reach. His photographs of family, a wife, a mother, a girl from the town where he had grown up, were kept in his locker alongside his socks and his cigarettes. The ship's motion affected the mess deck more acutely than the upper decks, partly because of its position in the ship's structure, and partly because the hammocks, swinging on their hooks, described the arc of every roll with a physical fidelity that sleeping men felt, even in their sleep. Meals were prepared centrally in the galley and brought to the mess in containers, or the mess itself prepared some of its food using the limited equipment available. The quality of what arrived was, by most accounts, more consistent than the peacetime reputation of naval catering might suggest, though the conditions under which it was consumed varied enormously with the weather. In a force 8 gale in the Atlantic winter, eating required holding the plate with one hand and the table with another, and the division of attention this required, meant that meals in heavy weather were functional rather than social events. Tea was always available. It was almost always strong. The Royal Navy's rating of an acceptable cup of tea ran to concentrations that most civilians would find approaching structural. There is a social history to the mess that deserves more attention than it typically receives. The mess system in the Royal Navy, in which groups of men were responsible for their own domestic arrangements, within the framework of centrally supplied rations, created small, self-governing communities within the ship. The leading hand of the mess, the senior rating within the group, was responsible for the mess bill, for maintaining order, and for the smooth running of the domestic arrangements. He was not a disciplinary officer in the formal sense. That responsibility rested with the petty officers and the officer hierarchy above them. But in the texture of daily life, the leading hand's authority over the mess was real and practically significant. A mess that worked well was a place where the tensions of shipboard life found a managed outlet. A mess that did not was a source of friction that the captain's coxswain, the ship's most senior non-commissioned officer, would eventually have to address. The men found ways, within these constraints, to construct something like ordinary life. There were card games. Uckers, a naval variant of Ludo played with an aggression that peacetime rules did not permit, was a persistent fixture of mess deck entertainment. And the competition was serious, in the way that only games played by men with few other outlets can be. There was conversation, which ranged from the practical to the personal, in ways that the formal structure of the ship discouraged elsewhere. There was the rum ration, the daily issue of a fixed measure of rum to ratings over the age of 20, a tradition that the Royal Navy had maintained since the 18th century, and that on a cold ship in mid-Atlantic carried a warmth that was both physical and psychological. The rum was issued at noon in the presence of a petty officer and was consumed immediately. Hoarding it was a disciplinary offence. And the ceremony around the issue was one of those moments of continuity with naval tradition that men found, somewhat to their own surprise, genuinely meaningful. It connected them to something older than the specific emergency they were in. Mail from home arrived when the ship was in port, in Liverpool, in Londonderry, in Greenock on the Clyde, and its distribution in the mess was one of the signal events of any harbour period. Men who received letters read them with a concentration that the ship never otherwise demanded of them. Men who did not receive letters occupied themselves with things that were plausibly not about the absence of letters. The correspondence went both ways, of course, and men wrote home under conditions that were constrained by censorship. Certain information could not be communicated, and by the practical difficulty of writing on a moving ship with cold hands. What got through in the letters that survive in family collections and regimental museums tends toward the mundane in a way that is not dishonesty, but is rather a considered form of kindness. The detail of the food, the observation about the weather, the inquiry about people at home, the ordinary texture of an ordinary life, transported into the most extraordinary circumstances, and presented back as if the circumstances were manageable. They were, mostly. And the letters were part of how they stayed manageable. The relationship between men in the same mess, across months and years of shared service, developed a particular intensity that was different from friendship in the civilian sense and harder to name. It was forged from proximity and dependence. The knowledge that the man in the next hammock was one of the people standing between you and the Atlantic. And it had a functional component that civilian friendships rarely carry. When a ship was at action stations, the man you had been playing cards with an hour ago was now at his post in the same network of action that your post was part of. The distinction between the social and the operational was very thin on a destroyer. They were the same men doing both things in the same small space. This created bonds that veterans of Atlantic service found, in later life, almost impossible to explain to people who had not experienced something similar. Not sentimental bonds necessarily. Practical ones, real ones, the kind that last. Chapter 5. What the Aztec operator heard. There is a temptation, when discussing the technological aspects of the Battle of the Atlantic, to reach for the dramatic. The cat and mouse pursuit, the depth charges rolling into the water, the agonizing wait. These things happened, and they will appear in this story. But before they can be properly understood, it is worth spending some time with what was actually happening in the Aztec compartment. During the long hours when nothing was happening, during the transits, the sweeps, the patrols, where the equipment returned only the background noise of the sea, because the Aztec operator's job was, for the vast majority of his time at the equipment, a job of listening to nothing and being prepared at any moment for it to become something. This requires a specific kind of attention. It is not exciting. It is exhausting in a way that excitement is not, because excitement, at least, gives the body something to do with the adrenaline. The Aztec system worked, in operational terms, as follows. The Aztec dome, a housing fitted to the bottom of the destroyer's hull containing the sound transducer, emitted a pulse of sound at a frequency calculated to travel well through seawater. The operator, wearing headphones in the Aztec compartment, listened for the return of that pulse, the sound it made when it struck a solid object in the water, and returned, was a distinctive ping, and the timing of the return allowed the operator to calculate a range. The bearing of the contact was determined by rotating the dome until the return was strongest. What the system could not do in its early wartime configuration was determine the depth at which the submarine was traveling, which was a significant tactical limitation that influenced how depth charge attacks were conducted, and which led to a number of attacks on good contacts that nevertheless failed to find the submarine because the depth settings were wrong. This problem was known, discussed, and worked on throughout the war, and the evolution of the depth charge pattern, from the initial simple pattern of 5 charges to the more sophisticated attacks of later years, including the introduction of the Hedgehog forward-throwing mortar in 1942, was in part a response to this limitation. The ASDIC operator was typically a specialist rating, trained at a shore establishment before joining his ship. But the training could not replicate the specific acoustic environment of a particular ocean in a particular season with a particular sea state. The North Atlantic presented its own challenges. The water column in the Atlantic contains thermal layers, boundaries between water masses of different temperatures that could refract the ASDIC pulse away from a submarine and create blind spots below a certain depth. A submarine commander who understood this, and the better ones did, could use the thermal layer as a kind of acoustic cover, sitting beneath it and presenting the ASDIC with an empty return while the escort's depth charges detonated at the wrong depth overhead. The ASDIC operators and the scientists who supported them knew this was happening. The tactical response was imperfect. It remained imperfect throughout the war, to a degree that the official histories were more candid about after the war than during it. What the operator actually heard through his headphones during a quiet patrol with no contact was not silence. The sea is not silent. It is a noise environment of considerable complexity. The biological sounds of marine life, the turbulence generated by the ship's own passage through the water, the acoustic signatures of other ships in the convoy or the escort group reverberating through the water column, the various creak and groan of the ship's own structure transmitted into the water. Experienced operators learn to read this ambient noise as a background against which the ping of a genuine contact stood out. Inexperienced operators found it confusing, particularly under the added pressure of an actual operational situation, where the captain was waiting for a report and the convoy was within U-boat range, and the stakes were very high. The training literature of the period was quite specific about the importance of experience in this role. The practical implication was that the best ASDIC operators were, to a significant degree, irreplaceable, not because the skill was impossible to teach, but because it took time to develop, and time was the one resource the Atlantic War consistently refused to provide. The false contact was the ASDIC operator's particular professional nightmare. Woken at 3 a.m, routed to the ASDIC compartment, the operator would sit down, take the bearing, listen, and make a judgment. If he reported a contact, the captain would bring the ship to action stations. The depth charge crews would man their stations, and the escort would leave the convoy, reducing its protection, to pursue what might be a U-boat, or might be a school of fish, a thermal boundary, a wreck on the seabed, or an entirely anomalous acoustic phenomenon. False contacts were not rare. They were, in the early years of the war, a genuine problem, and they consumed time and fuel and the already stretched attention of crews who could not afford to chase phantoms. The improvement of ASDIC training and the accumulation of operational experience reduced false contacts over the course of the war, but they never disappeared entirely, and the operator who called a contact knew he was making a judgment, not a certainty, and carried that knowledge in the headphones every watch. There is a broader point here about the relationship between technology and the people who use it, and it is one that the Battle of the Atlantic illustrates with particular clarity. The ASDIC was the Royal Navy's best anti-submarine tool in 1939, and it was significantly better than nothing. But it required skilled operators, tactical understanding, and the willingness to acknowledge its limitations, none of which were automatically present in a rapidly expanding wartime navy that needed to fill billets faster than the training system could qualify people. The gap between the technology's theoretical capability and its actual operational performance in the first 2 years of the war was real, and it contributed to the losses that made the Atlantic War's early period so grim. This is not a criticism of the men who operated the equipment. It is an observation about the general principle that weapons are only as effective as the human context surrounding them. A principle that the Atlantic War demonstrated repeatedly in various directions across 6 years. The watch in the ASDIC compartment ended, and the operator handed over to his relief. A process that required not just the physical handing over of the headphones, but a briefing on the acoustic conditions encountered during the watch, any unusual returns, the current sea state, and its effect on propagation. Then he made his way to the mess, and the hammock, and whatever portion of the available 8 hours had not been consumed by the handover, and the journey and the cup of tea that was, in some sense, not optional. And somewhere in the water outside the hull, at a depth that the ASDIC might or might not have found, the Battle of the Atlantic continued. Chapter 6. The convoy and what it meant. The convoy was the central fact of the Atlantic War, the organizing principle around which nearly everything else was arranged. It was not a simple or obvious idea, at least not in the context of 1939, when the dominant naval thinking held that convoys were defensive, and therefore strategically passive, and that the better approach to the submarine threat was offensive patrolling, hunting the U-boats directly rather than protecting merchant ships from them. This debate, which is well documented in the secondary literature and which ran through the Admiralty at a level that influenced policy in ways that cost lives, was eventually resolved in favor of the convoy system, not because the strategic theory changed, but because the arithmetic of loss became impossible to ignore. Ships sailing independently were being sunk far faster than ships in convoy. The math was not subtle, but it took time to win the argument fully, and in the early period of the war, the incompleteness of convoy coverage contributed to losses that a faster institutional decision might have reduced. This is one of those historical debates that remains genuinely open at the margins, and it is worth acknowledging rather than smoothing over. A convoy in the North Atlantic was a remarkable and strange thing to see from the bridge of an escort destroyer. It consisted typically of between 30 and 60 merchant ships, the numbers varying considerably with the specific convoy and the period of the war, arranged in columns, maintaining a speed determined by the slowest vessel in the formation, which in the early war years could be as low as 7 or 8 knots. The columns were spaced approximately 600 meters apart, and the ships within each column maintained a similar interval. Viewed from ahead, the convoy presented a broad front of hulls and funnels, and the smoke that the older coal-burning merchantmen produced. Smoke that remained a tactical problem throughout the war because it advertised the convoy's position across many miles of horizon. The escort, typically a small number of destroyers and corvettes in the early war years, growing to more substantial and better coordinated escort groups as the war progressed, was arranged around this formation, ahead, on the flanks, and astern. The destroyer's position in this arrangement was not fixed. The escort commander, typically the most senior officer among the escort, ships who might be embarked in a destroyer or a sloop, could redistribute the escorts in response to intelligence or tactical developments, concentrating strength on a threatened flank or detaching ships for a specific hunt. A destroyer on the screen might spend 8 hours on the convoy's port quarter, then be ordered ahead, then be detached to investigate a contact, then ordered to rejoin. This constant repositioning was navigationally demanding and physically demanding because the repositioning was done at speed, and the speed in heavy weather meant more violent motion and more strain on the ship and its crew. But the alternative, a static defensive screen, was a worse solution, and the tactical flexibility of the destroyer was exactly what the convoy protection system needed. The merchantmen the destroyers were protecting were not, from the perspective of a young Royal Navy rating, always straightforward to regard with admiration. Merchant ships were civilian vessels under charter, operated by their own companies under their own masters, and their relationship with the naval escort was occasionally strained in ways that operational accounts do not always capture. Merchant captains who had been at sea for 30 years had their own views on how ships should be handled and did not invariably defer to the tactical instructions of a naval officer who might be half their age. Station keeping, the maintenance of the assigned position within the convoy formation, was an operational requirement that some merchant vessels executed better than others, and a convoy in which ships drifted out of station at night was harder to protect than one in which the formation was maintained. The escort's job was complicated, in short, not just by the enemy, but by the complexity of managing a large formation of independently minded vessels across hundreds of miles of ocean in all weather conditions. The signals traffic between escorts and merchantmen in convoy records contains, if you read it carefully, a degree of diplomatic patience on the part of the naval officers that speaks to considerable professional self-control. The approach of a wolf pack, the coordinated U-boat attack that Grand Admiral Dönitz had developed as the primary German tactical doctrine for Atlantic operations, transformed the convoy's world in ways that were immediate and total. The wolf pack operated by first locating a convoy with a single U-boat, which would then maintain contact and broadcast the convoy's position, course, and speed to other boats in the group, which would converge on the convoy from multiple directions and attack, typically at night on the surface, when the U-boats were faster and the ASDIC was less effective against a surface-running vessel. The escort's response to this was to attempt to drive the shadowing U-boat below the surface, where it was slower and could be tracked by ASDIC while maintaining coverage of the convoy. But with 4 or 5 escorts protecting 60 merchant ships against 6 or 8 U-boats attacking simultaneously from different bearings, the geometry was deeply unfavorable. In the worst convoy battles, and the worst were very bad, multiple merchant ships could be lost in a single night, while the escorts were fully occupied and nonetheless unable to be everywhere at once. For the men on the escort destroyers, the Wolfpack attack meant action stations, which meant leaving the hammock and moving fast to a position that had been drilled so thoroughly that it could be reached in near total darkness at 4 in the morning with less thought than breath required. The action station was a man-specific post. His gun, his fire hose, his depth charge station, his position on the bridge, and reaching it was the first step in a choreography that the ship's company had been rehearsing since the day they commissioned. What came next depended on the specific attack. It might be a depth charge run on an ASDIC contact while the convoy continued on its course. It might be a high-speed dash toward a flare or an explosion on the water. It might be the specific job of rescue, pulling men from the sea who had been aboard a merchantman 2 minutes ago and who were now in Atlantic, water that was cold enough in winter to render a man incapable within minutes. The destroyer's role encompassed all of these simultaneously, and the decisions about which to prioritize, to pursue a submarine contact and risk losing survivors, or to stop and rescue and risk losing the contact, were among the most genuinely difficult decisions that the Battle of the Atlantic produced. They were made by young men at speed, in the dark, in weather that did not make anything easier, and they were made many thousands of times over the course of the campaign. By the time the convoy reached port, Liverpool or Halifax, Fremantle or Gibraltar, depending on the route, and the escort vessels followed it in to refuel and reammunition, and in port for 48 hours or perhaps 72 hours. To sleep in a bunk that did not move, the men on the destroyer had been at sea for somewhere between 7 and 21 days, depending on the route and the specific convoy cycle. They had kept watches, eaten what was available, serviced the machinery, trained the guns, read the ASDIC contacts, written their letters, and maintained the 1,000 small disciplines of shipboard life that kept a vessel of this size operational in a hostile ocean. They had done this without interruption, in conditions that ranged from merely uncomfortable to genuinely severe, and within a period that stretched from days to a week, depending on how quickly the yards could service the ship. They would take her back out again. This cycle, in, out, for months and years on end, is what the Battle of the Atlantic actually consisted of. Not dramatic battles, though those happened. Not individual acts of extraordinary courage, though those happened too. The core of the campaign was repetition, endurance, the accumulation of watch upon watch upon watch, across 6 years of ocean, until the job was done. Chapter 7, The Happy Time and the Long Darkness. There is a phrase in the operational history of the German submarine arm that appears in the original German as a term the U-boat crews used among themselves to describe the first period of the Atlantic War, and it translates with a flatness that says something about the nature of language under pressure as the happy time. The historians who use this phrase, and they use it carefully, because it describes something with a precise meaning from one perspective and an entirely different meaning from another, are referring to a period running roughly from the summer of 1940 through the spring of 1941, during which the U-boats were sinking Allied merchant tonnage at a rate that the Admiralty's planners regarded with something approaching strategic despair. For the men on the Royal Navy's escort destroyers during these months, the happy time was not a phrase in common use. What they experienced was a succession of convoys that arrived in port with fewer ships than had left, and the knowledge that the ships they had failed to protect had gone down with men aboard them. The arithmetic of this period was genuinely terrible, and it shaped everything about the Atlantic War's subsequent development. The tactics, the technology, the institutional culture of the escort forces, in ways that can only be understood by sitting with the darkness of the period itself. The problem in the first year of the Atlantic War was not, at its root, a failure of courage or of competence on the part of the escort crews. It was a problem of numbers and geometry that no amount of determination could solve unaided. In the summer and autumn of 1940, the total number of effective ocean escort vessels available to Western Approaches Command, the headquarters organization responsible for the North Atlantic convoy routes, then based at Plymouth, was inadequate to the scale of the threat. Full ocean escort, meaning escort coverage from the British Isles to mid-Atlantic and back, was not possible with the numbers available. Convoys were escorted for part of their passage, and then, at the limit of the escort's range, handed off or left to proceed independently. In the mid-Atlantic gap, the area beyond the practical range of both land-based air cover and surface escorts, convoys were, for a period measured in days, unprotected. The U-boat command understood this. The sinkings in this area during the peak months of the happy time reflected that understanding with a precision that was, from the German perspective, operational success. The transfer of 60 destroyers from the United States Navy under the Destroyers for Bases Agreement of September 1940 brought new hulls into service, but the process of refitting and crewing them was not instantaneous, and condition of some of the transferred vessels created challenges that the receiving crews addressed with the pragmatic resourcefulness that had become a defining characteristic of wartime naval service. Some of these ships, old, flush-decked four-stakers from the First World War era, had handling characteristics that differed substantially from what Royal Navy crews were accustomed to. They rolled differently. Their range and endurance characteristics, while in some cases better than the ships they supplemented, required adjustment in how operations were planned. Men who had trained on one type found themselves at sea in another, applying principles of seamanship in a vessel whose responses they were still learning. This was not ideal. It was the reality of a war being fought with the tools available, and the crews made it work. Western Approaches Command itself moved, in February 1941, from Plymouth to Liverpool, a decision that placed the operational headquarters closer to the primary convoy, terminal, and the main body of the escort forces, and that brought the administrative and tactical machinery of convoy protection into closer physical proximity with the reality it was managing. The move reflected a growing understanding at the institutional level that the Atlantic campaign required a different kind of organizational attention than the traditional naval headquarters model had been providing. The operational research that supported the Atlantic campaign, the analysis of sinkings, the evaluation of ASDIC contacts, the study of U-boat tactics was becoming more systematic, and the headquarters function was becoming more central to how the campaign was fought. What this meant at the level of the destroyer crew was a gradually improving flow of intelligence and tactical guidance. The improvement was real, but it was gradual, and in the dark months of 1941, it was not yet sufficient to reverse the balance. The corvettes, small, tough, ocean-going escort vessels, built to a modified whale catcher design that the Royal Navy had ordered in large numbers before the war, as a cheap and quickly producible escort type, were arriving in service during this period in growing numbers, and they changed the character of the escort forces in ways that deserve mention. The Flower-class corvette was not a destroyer. It displaced roughly 900 tons, reached speeds of around 16 knots, and moved in heavy seas, with a motion that experienced destroyer men described, with some feeling, as severe. But it had the range and the sea-keeping ability to remain with a convoy across the full North Atlantic, and it could carry ASTIC equipment and depth charges, and it could be crewed by men who had been civilians 6 months earlier and were now learning their trade under operational conditions. The corvettes and the destroyers operated in mixed escort groups, and the relationship between their crews, different speeds, different capabilities, different institutional traditions, was, over time, a productive one. The corvette men were not destroyer men. They knew it, and the destroyer men knew it, and in the end it did not much matter, because what both were doing was the same job. The period between the summer of 1940 and the spring of 1943 is, in the scholarship on the Battle of the Atlantic, the long darkness, the years in which the outcome was genuinely uncertain, in which the sinkings of Allied merchant ships were in real, calculable tension with the rate of replacement construction, and in which the men conducting the escort were doing so without the full suite of tools that would eventually turn the battle. It was during this period that most of the ordinary experience of Atlantic destroyer service took place. The watches, the convoys, the contacts, the losses, the returns to port, and the return to sea. The dramatic moments were embedded within the routine, and the routine was what the men lived. Understanding the long darkness is understanding that the Atlantic War was not decided by any single event, or weapon or tactical innovation, but by the accumulated effort of men doing a necessary and demanding job, day after day, watch after watch, in conditions that would have defeated most of what ordinary life asks of people. By the autumn of 1941, the intelligence picture was beginning to improve in ways that could not, at the time, be publicly acknowledged or officially explained, and that the men benefiting from improved convoy routing, understood as good fortune or good signals intelligence, without necessarily knowing the precise source. The routing of convoys away from concentrations of U-boats, made possible by work that remained secret for decades after the war, began to reduce losses on some routes. The operational reality for destroyer crews was that sometimes the convoy passed through areas where contacts were expected and no contacts materialized. An absence of attack that was, from the crew's perspective, unremarkable, but that was, from a broader perspective, the result of significant effort by people they would never meet. The gap between what the crew could see from the bridge and what was actually happening in the wider battle was very large, and it remained large throughout the war. Sailors are, by the nature of their work, operating in one small part of a much larger system, and the full picture is, in the nature of the thing, not available from the bridge of a destroyer at sea. The sinkings, when they came, were rarely distant events. A merchantman torpedoed in a convoy was visible from the escort. The flash, the column of water or flame, the sudden stillness of a ship that had been making way moments before, and was now stopped and beginning to settle. The escort's standing orders in the early period of the war were ambiguous on the question of rescue. Stopping to pick up survivors made the escort itself a stationary target, and the doctrine that eventually emerged, that rescue was a secondary task during an active attack, was the product of painful operational experience rather than hacklessness. The men who saw a ship go down and maintained their course and speed because their orders and the tactical situation required it carried that experience in a particular way. It was not guilt, exactly. They understood the reasoning. But it was not comfortable either, and the men who wrote about it afterward wrote about it with a specificity that suggested it remained with them for a long time. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was, for the Western approaches destroyer crews, Another hard season in a succession of hard seasons. The North Atlantic in winter operates at scales and intensities that the word weather does not quite cover. Storm systems that tracked across the Atlantic from west to east could persist for days, generating sea states that broke equipment, exhausted crews, and, in a small number of documented cases, caused structural damage to the lighter escort vessels. Depth charges worked loose from their racks. Boats were stove in. The forward gun positions were flooded with green water on a rhythm that the gun crews learned to anticipate and work around. The ship rolled to angles that made movement about the decks, a matter of deliberate and careful navigation, and the men who had been at sea for a year had developed, almost without noticing it, a way of moving aboard a ship in heavy weather that was second nature, and that they would carry in their bodies for the rest of their lives. The automatic reach for the nearest support, the planted stance, the balance that adjusted before the conscious mind had registered the need for adjustment. What the men in these conditions were demonstrating was not, by the end of the long darkness, something that needed to be argued for or explained. It was simply the accumulated product of experience, of watch upon watch, convoy upon convoy, season up season in a demanding ocean doing a necessary job. The quality that sustained them was not dramatic. It was patient. It was the quality of people who had understood, at some point early in their service, that the job did not end, that the sea did not care, and that the only workable response to both of these facts was to continue. This is not a celebrated quality in the way that acts of immediate bravery are celebrated, and it does not generate the kind of narrative that newspapers and official communiques prefer. But it is what the Atlantic War actually required, and the men of the Royal Navy's destroyer forces supplied it, day after day, in quantities that exceeded what anyone had a right to expect. Chapter 8. The Science and the Struggle. The story of the Battle of the Atlantic is, among other things, a story about the relationship between science and warfare, about how technical problems generated scientific effort, and how scientific results changed what was possible in the operational sphere. This is not a simple or linear story. The technical improvements that eventually helped turn the Atlantic campaign did not arrive all at once, did not arrive without significant friction between operational requirements and scientific capacity, and did not arrive in time to prevent losses that better technology might have reduced. What happened was a process, a long, contested, sometimes frustrating negotiation between what the men at sea needed and what the laboratories and workshops ashore could produce. Understanding this process is essential to understanding why the war in the Atlantic went the way it did, and why the men aboard the destroyers were, for the better part of 3 years, fighting with tools that were adequate but not quite sufficient. The radar revolution in the escort forces arrived progressively, beginning in earnest in 1941 and continuing through 1943 as increasingly capable sets were fitted to destroyers and other escort vessels. Early shipborne radar, metric wavelength equipment that could detect a surfaced U-boat at ranges of several miles under suitable conditions, was a significant addition to the escort detection capability at night, when the U-boats preferred to attack on the surface, and the human lookouts' effectiveness was limited by darkness. A surfaced U-boat presents a small radar signature, but a small radar signature is infinitely better than none, and the transition from purely visual and ASDIC detection to a system that included radar changed the tactical calculus of the night attack in ways that the U-boat command eventually found very difficult to counter. The installation of centimetric radar equipment using much shorter wavelengths, capable of detecting a submarine periscope or a U-boat snorkel, installed in growing numbers from 1943 onward, extended this advantage further, and the combination of radar and ASDIC and increasingly capable aircraft gave the convoy escorts, by the middle of the war, a detection suite that the U-boats could not easily evade. The development of high-frequency direction finding, known to everyone who used it as Huff-Duff, a phrase that sits in the operational records of the Atlantic campaign, with a cheerful matter-of-factness that somewhat belies the significance of what it enabled, gave escort commanders the ability to take a bearing on a U-boat's radio transmissions and determine its approximate position relative to the convoy. The U-boats used radio extensively, reporting convoy positions to the command in France and receiving instructions and tactical direction. In return, and this radio traffic was their operational vulnerability. A U-boat transmitting is a U-boat that can be located by a ship fitted with the right equipment. The introduction of Huff-Duff sets on escort vessels in growing numbers through 1942 meant that the U-boat shadowing the convoy and radioing its position was simultaneously giving the escort a bearing that could be used to run it down and drive it off before it had drawn the wolf pack in. This did not always work. The geometry was not always favourable. The transmission might be brief, the bearing might be imprecise, but it worked often enough to matter, and its operational significance was acknowledged in the official assessments, though not always with the precision the operational records support. For the destroyer crews, these technical improvements arrived as new equipment to be learned, maintained, and integrated into existing routines. The rating who had been trained as an ASDIC operator now also needed to understand what the radar was telling him, or to work alongside a dedicated radar operator who needed to understand what the ASDIC was telling the rest of the team. The bridge team that had been managing navigation, communications, and ASDIC contacts now had radar contacts to integrate. The escort commander, who had been plotting convoy positions and estimated submarine positions on his chart now, had Huff-Duff bearings to plot as well. None of this was beyond the capacity of trained naval personnel, but it added to the cognitive and administrative load of operations that were already demanding, and it required training that could not always be conducted as thoroughly as the textbooks would have preferred before the equipment was needed in action. This is a recurring theme in the technical history of the Atlantic campaign, and it deserves acknowledgement. The gap between the technical capability of the equipment and its effective operational employment was a real one, bridged by the improvisation and professional adaptability of the men who used it. The science of depth charge attack was also evolving through this period. The basic depth charge, a cylindrical canister of high explosive with a hydrostatic pistol, had changed relatively little since the First World War, but the understanding of how to use it effectively had developed considerably. The problem was the geometry. A depth charge attack required the attacking ship to pass over the position of the submarine, at which point the ASDIC contact was lost, because the ASDIC could not see directly beneath the ship, and the ship then had to estimate where the submarine would be by the time the charges reached the correct depth. If the submarine altered course in the interval between the loss of ASDIC contact and the detonation of the charges, and it almost certainly would, the attack might miss entirely. The dead time, as it was called in the tactical literature, was the central problem of depth charge attack, and it was addressed in several ways over the course of the war. The Hedgehog, introduced in significant numbers from 1942 onward, was a forward-throwing weapon that fired a pattern of small contact-fused bombs ahead of the attacking ship, allowing it to maintain ASDIC contact during the attack. The improvement in effectiveness this represented was, on the basis of the operational statistics, substantial. The men in the engine room contributed to the science of the Atlantic campaign in ways that went largely unrecorded. The endurance of a destroyer at sea, how far she could go before needing to refuel, was a function of how economically the engineering department could operate the machinery, and the difference between a ship run at technically optimum settings and one run at settings that reflected the particular characteristics of that specific set of turbines, worn to their current tolerances by months of hard service, was not negligible. Chief engineers on destroyers developed, through experience, an intimate understanding of their specific machinery that no manual fully captured, and this understanding translated directly into operational capability. A ship that could extend her range by 10% through careful management of fuel consumption could stay with a convoy for longer, or reach a position that a less carefully managed ship could not reach. The engineering departments of the Atlantic destroyers were, in this sense, doing operational science of their own. Empirical, unglamorous, indispensable. The medical dimension of Atlantic service is one of the less documented aspects of destroyer life, and it deserves a moment. The medical officer on a destroyer, when there was one, which was not always the case in the smaller escort vessels, was a doctor who had been a civilian physician perhaps 2 years ago, and who was now responsible for the health of 200 men in a ship that had no way to transfer a seriously ill patient to a hospital for as long as it was at sea. The sick bay on a destroyer was small. A few bunks, a medicine chest, basic surgical equipment. The medical officer's scope of practice in the Atlantic was determined by what the sick bay contained, and what the doctor's training had covered, and the conditions under which that practice was exercised. The motion of the ship, the limited space, the absence of specialist support were not what medical schools had prepared their graduates for. The men treated in these sick bays recovered, or did not recover, in conditions of considerable practical difficulty, and the medical officers who served in them adapted their practice to reality in ways that medical history has not always given its proper attention. The operational research branch that supported Western Approach's command, scientists who analyzed the data from convoy operations and used it to develop tactical recommendations, was an institutional innovation of the Atlantic campaign that later scholarship has recognized as genuinely significant. The application of quantitative analysis to questions like optimal convoy size, optimal escort screen geometry, and the tactical use of air cover produced results that informed policy in measurable ways. The recommendation on convoy size, larger convoys with the same number of escorts, were found to be statistically safer than smaller convoys. Counterintuitive as this seemed, is perhaps the most cited output of this work, and it led to changes in convoy organization that the available evidence suggests reduced losses. The men on the destroyer bridges were not aware of this analysis in real time. They received the tactical guidance that flowed from it without necessarily knowing its origin. The science happened ashore, and the results arrived at sea as standing orders and recommended procedures, embedded in the routine of operations. The relationship between the science ashore and the practice at sea was not always smooth. There are documented cases in the operational record of tactical recommendations from the analysis branch that encountered resistance from experienced officers who felt their operational judgment was being second-guessed by people who had not been to sea in a U-boat war. This tension is neither surprising nor, in retrospect, entirely unreasonable. The scientists were working from aggregate data, and aggregate data conceals the specific and the local, which is what operational experience lives in. The resolution, where it occurred, was through the kind of institutional trust building that takes time and requires both sides to demonstrate good faith. The Battle of the Atlantic provided an unusually concentrated period in which this process was forced to work at speed, and the results, by the middle of 1943, when the balance of the campaign had shifted decisively, suggest that it did imperfectly work. For the rating on the destroyer who understood none of this wider context, who knew his ship, his watch, his mess, his specific piece of equipment, the science of the Atlantic War was not something he thought about in analytical terms. What he experienced was the gradual improvement of conditions over time. The radar that allowed the escort to detect surfaced U-boats at night, the huff-duff that gave the bridge a bearing to work with, the improved depth charge patterns that produced more confirmed kills and fewer frustrating attacks on contacts that vanished. The improvement was real, and he could feel it, in the same way that a craftsman can feel the improvement of his tools, without being able to articulate the metallurgy. The war was still the war. The watch was still the watch. But by the middle years, there was a different quality to the odds, and the men on the Atlantic destroyers, who knew the odds better than most, could feel that too. Chapter 9. The Captain and the Bridge. There is a question that the formal history of naval command tends to approach from the outside, through the lens of tactics and strategic outcomes. That is, in some ways, more interesting from the inside. What was it actually like to be the commanding officer of a Royal Navy destroyer in the Atlantic War? Not in the sense of the burdens of command, which is a phrase that covers the territory without illuminating it, but in the specific, daily, granular sense of what that job required of a human being, hour by hour, through a commission that might last a year or more without significant respite. The answer involves things that naval history talks about: tactical skill, seamanship, the management of men, and things it talks about less: the management of uncertainty, the maintenance of authority under exhaustion, and the particular loneliness of a position in which the formal hierarchy makes it difficult to share the weight of the decisions. The commanding officer of a wartime destroyer was almost certainly young by the standards of pre-war promotion. A lieutenant commander in command might be 28 or 29 years old. In some documented cases, commands were held by officers younger than this, particularly in the smaller escort vessels. The youth of these officers was not, in itself, a problem. Naval training was specifically designed to build command competence in people who would exercise it young. But it meant that the man responsible for the ship and everyone aboard her was doing so at an age when most people in any other profession were still mid-level operatives, and he was doing it without the support structures that normally cushion the exercise of significant responsibility. The naval hierarchy provided oversight in the form of the escort commander and the shore commands. But at sea, at 0300 hours, in deteriorating weather, with the ASDIC contact developing into something that might or might not be a wolf pack, the commanding officer was the decision point, and there was no one else. The captain's relationship with his first lieutenant, the ship's executive officer, responsible for the internal administration and discipline of the crew, was the primary professional relationship of shipboard life, and its quality shaped the functioning of the entire vessel. A first lieutenant who understood his captain's intent and could translate it into the Daily routine of the ship, training, maintenance, discipline, the management of the many small frictions of shipboard life freed the captain to focus on the operational picture. A first lieutenant who did not have this quality, or who had it but was at odds with his captain, created a headquarters problem that sat behind every operational challenge. The published memoirs of destroyer officers contain a disproportionate number of observations about first lieutenants, both good and otherwise, which suggests that the relationship mattered to the captains in a way that stayed with them long after the specific tactical events had faded. The captain kept the sea in a different way than the rest of the crew. He was not formally required to stand watches in the same rotation as the watch officers, but in practice, the commanding officer of a destroyer in the Atlantic during active operations spent a great deal of time on the bridge, more than the watch bill required, more, sometimes, than was strictly rational. The officer of the watch was competent. The standing orders were clear. The captain could sleep. But the captain often did not sleep, or slept in the sea cabin immediately below the bridge. A small compartment with a bunk and a voice pipe connecting him to the bridge, where he could be reached in seconds. This was not exactly insomnia, though it sometimes became that. It was a professional disposition developed in response to the specific character of Atlantic operations, where the situation could change from unremarkable to critical in the time it took a torpedo to run to its target. Captains who trusted their officers, who had selected well and trained well, found this easier to manage. Those who did not carried a larger personal load. The exercise of authority on the bridge of a destroyer in Atlantic conditions required the management of a particular kind of information environment. The captain was receiving data from the ASDIC operator, from the radar, from the lookouts, from the signals communications, from the chart, from the feel of the ship itself beneath his feet, and from the convoy he could see or could not see, depending on visibility. He was weighting these inputs against standing orders, against tactical doctrine, against the specific intelligence available about the U-boat dispositions, and against his own reading of what was happening and what was about to happen. The synthesis of all of this into a decision, turn to port and investigate the contact, or maintain course and increase speed to reach a different bearing, was not a mechanical process. It was a judgment made by a person under conditions of time pressure and incomplete information. The quality of that judgment varied between individuals and varied within individuals, depending on how rested they were, how long they had been in command, and where they were in the specific rhythm of the operation. The official records capture the decisions. They capture less well the conditions under which the decisions were made. Communication between escort ships was a significant constraint on tactical flexibility, particularly in the early period of the war. The primary means of communication between ships in company was radio, but radio transmitted in the clear could be, and was, intercepted by German signals intelligence, and coded radio was slower and more cumbersome, and radio silence was sometimes required for tactical reasons. The oldest lamp, the high-intensity signal lamp that could communicate in Morse code between ships within visual range, was faster than coded radio for short messages and could not be intercepted except by other ships within the line of sight. The flag signal, hoisting coloured flags to communicate prearranged meanings, was faster still for standard messages but required daylight and visibility. An escort commander coordinating 3 destroyers and 4 corvettes in a deteriorating tactical situation at night, in rain, was doing so with communication tools that were both limited in bandwidth and constrained by the tactical situation itself. The art of escort group coordination was, in significant part, the art of communicating just enough information in the right form at the right moment using whatever medium was available. The captain's relationship with the convoy commodore, the senior officer aboard the merchant ship designated to lead the convoy, responsible for the formation and the merchant vessels, was another layer of the command picture that operational histories tend to simplify. The convoy commodore was typically a retired admiral or senior merchant officer embarked in one of the merchant ships, with no direct authority over the naval escorts, but with considerable influence over the merchant ship's behavior. The relationship between the naval escort commander and the convoy commodore was, formally, cooperative. Each had authority over their own sphere, and the safe passage of the convoy depended on both exercising that authority competently. In practice, the relationship varied. A convoy commodore who understood the tactical situation and could enforce discipline on his merchant ships made the escort's job significantly easier. The signals traffic that survives from convoy operations contains, here and there, exchanges between escort commanders and convoy commodores that illuminate the negotiated character of convoy authority with a kind of businesslike candor that is not without its own interest. The captain's watch bill, informal as it was, produced a pattern of sleep deprivation that was cumulative and that increased over the course of a commission. Accounts from officers who served as destroyer captains in the Atlantic describe a particular quality of tiredness that developed after months of command, not acute exhaustion, but a deep structural fatigue that sat below the surface of normal functioning, and that affected, in ways not always apparent to the person experiencing it, the margin of cognitive reserve available for the unexpected. The Royal Navy's system of rotation, ships came in for refit and repair, and captains might be given shore appointments between commands, provided some relief. But the timing of rotation was not driven by the psychological state of individual captains, and men remained in command for periods that the modern understanding of cognitive fatigue under stress would regard with some concern. This is not a criticism of a system operating under wartime resource constraints. It is an honest observation about what the campaign asked of its officers. The moments of acute crisis, the wolf-pack attacks, the engine room emergencies, the decisions about rescue versus pursuit, were what the official histories documented. The spaces between those moments, which were far more numerous and which were where most of commanding actually happened, are less well recorded. What filled those spaces was not drama, but maintenance. Of the ship, of the crew, of the routine that held everything together. A good commanding officer visited the mess decks regularly, not to inspect but to be present, to know the men, to pick up the quality of the atmosphere that no formal report could fully convey. He knew which men were struggling and which were solid. He knew the senior rates, who were the real human fabric of the ship's functioning. He attended to the small and the particular in ways that the formal hierarchy did not require, but that the ship, in a practical sense, needed. This too was what command consisted of. It was not cited in dispatches. It was what made the difference, day after day, between a ship that functioned and one that did not. Chapter 10. Fear, Cold, and the North Atlantic Winter. There is a detail in several of the published memoirs of Royal Navy Atlantic Service that appears too consistently to be incidental, the cold. Not the abstract cold of a weather report, force 8 with temperatures approaching freezing, but the specific, physical, personal cold that accumulated over a watch, penetrated the duffel coat and the heavy sweater and the long underwear, and settled into the hands and the face, and eventually the ability to perform fine motor tasks with any precision. The men on the open bridges of the early war destroyers were cold in a way that the later enclosed bridges ameliorated but did not eliminate. The men on the gun decks were cold. The lookouts, exposed by the nature of their role to whatever the Atlantic chose to produce, were cold. The cold was not an emergency, it was a condition. And conditions, unlike emergencies, do not get managed and then resolved. They have to be endured, and endurance has a cost that compounds over time. The North Atlantic in winter occupies a portion of the natural world that operates by rules that most people who have not been there cannot easily imagine from descriptions. The fetch of the ocean, the distance over which wind has been pushing water, in the North Atlantic is measured in thousands of kilometers, which means that by the time a westerly gale has been blowing for 3 days, the waves it has generated are not the waves of a coastal storm, but something older and larger and more patient. A destroyer in a North Atlantic winter storm was not simply a ship in bad weather. It was a small object in a very large system that had been building for days before the ship arrived in it, and that would continue for days after the ship had gone. The sea states described in the logbooks of Atlantic escorts, Force 8, Force 9, Force 10, correspond to wave heights and wind speeds that are difficult to translate into non-maritime terms. But the effect on a ship of 1,200 to 2,000 tons was physical and total. Everything moved. Everything made noise. Everything required constant physical effort to maintain. The relationship between Atlantic service and what later generations would recognize as chronic stress responses was not discussed in wartime terms, but was present in the operational record, in forms that the observant historian can identify. Captains of escort vessels noted in their reports that men who had been on sustained Atlantic service for extended periods showed changes in performance and temperament that experience told them was related to cumulative fatigue rather than individual weakness. Men who had performed well for a year were sometimes, by the 18th month, performing less well, not dramatically, not in ways that necessarily generated formal action, but in ways that were visible to those who knew them well. The Royal Navy's response to this was imperfect by later standards. Rest, where it could be provided, shore leave where the harbour periods allowed, the rum ration, the communal support of the mess. These were not inadequate responses. They were the responses available in the circumstances, and they maintained operational effectiveness across a 6-year campaign, which is a statement about the resilience of the people involved as much as about the adequacy of the support. Fear on a destroyer in the Atlantic occupied a particular position in the emotional landscape of the ship. It was present. Anyone who claimed otherwise in the published memoir literature was, by the consensus of other memoirists who wrote with greater candor, simplifying. The fear was not constant. The mind cannot maintain acute anxiety indefinitely, and the routines of watchkeeping and shipboard life provided structure that modulated the emotional state through most of the operational cycle. But it was available, always, as an undercurrent, and it became acute in specific circumstances. When a torpedo track was sighted from the bridge, when the ship was at action stations and the situation was developing in multiple directions at once, when a ship in the convoy was hit and the navigator was plotting the geometry of where the torpedo had come from. The acute fear was, in a sense, functional. It accelerated response and focused attention. It was the chronic background variety, the awareness maintained over months That one's ship was a target in an ocean that provided no cover and no retreat, that accumulated in ways that were harder to manage. The management of fear on a small ship was partly institutional. The watch system's rhythms imposed a structure that carried men through the times, when individual willpower alone might not have been sufficient, and partly personal. Senior ratings and officers who could model the appropriate emotional register. Not falsely cheerful, not grimly fatalistic, but steady, provided a kind of psychological tone for the spaces around them. A petty officer who had been at sea for 2 years and who faced a deteriorating tactical situation with the specific kind of calm that comes from having faced similar situations before and come through them was, in a quiet and unproclaimed way, sustaining the effectiveness of the men who worked alongside him. The institutional language of the Royal Navy, the understatement, the professional matter-of-factness, the complete avoidance of dramatics, was not, in this context, emotional repression. It was a functional code that allowed men to communicate competence and steadiness in conditions where dramatics would have been operationally costly. The cold and the fear existed alongside a third element of Atlantic service that is perhaps harder to name: monotony. The watch kept, the watch handed over, the meal eaten, the hammock reached, the hammock left, the watch kept again. The convoy moved at 7 knots. The ocean was very large. The days when nothing happened, no contacts, no alerts, no visible drama, were far more numerous than the days when something did. The challenge of remaining alert and operationally effective during the long, quiet transits was different in character from the challenge of managing a wolfpack attack, but was, in the aggregate, more demanding in terms of cumulative cost. An attack required everything a man had, immediately and fully. A week-long quiet transit required a different kind of sustained attention. The willingness to be ready, continuously, for something that might not come. And this is a harder thing to maintain than the popular imagination of combat tends to allow. The ASDIC operator listening for 3 hours to the ambient noise of the sea, the lookout sweeping the horizon every 30 seconds for a periscope or a distress signal that might or might not be there. These men were doing something that was neither dramatic nor trivial, and the discipline required for it was of a kind that does not photograph well, but that was essential to the campaign. The men developed, over time, personal strategies for managing the conditions. Some read. The ship's library, such as it was, circulated through the mess decks, and the reading material was varied in ways that reflected the range of backgrounds among the crew. Some wrote letters, which the censorship requirement made into a particular kind of compositional challenge. Some maintained the tools and equipment of their branch with a care that exceeded what operational necessity strictly required, not from excess of conscientiousness, but because the physical work of maintenance provided something to do that had tangible outcome in the form of clean and ready equipment. Some talked, in the specific way of men sharing a small and difficult space, about the things that were far away, home, food that was not tinned, a particular place they wanted to go back to, what they were going to do when this was over. The conversations about what came after were common enough to constitute a genre of their own. The imagined future as a counterweight to the very concrete present, and the specificity with which men described their intended post-war lives suggests that the imagined future was doing real, psychological work in sustaining them through the actual one. The physical toll of Atlantic service was cumulative in ways that peacetime naval service had not prepared the medical establishment for. The combination of cold, wet, broken sleep, a diet that was nutritionally adequate but not optimal, and sustained exposure to noise and vibration produced. Over the course of an 18-month to 2-year commission, a physical condition in many men that a medical examination at the beginning of the commission would not have predicted. Dental problems exacerbated by the limited dental care available at sea. Dermatological conditions associated with prolonged saltwater exposure and limited hygiene facilities. Musculoskeletal issues related to the physical demands of working on a moving, rolling ship in heavy weather. These were not dramatic injuries. They did not generate citations or attract official attention. They were the physical residue of doing a hard job in hard conditions for a long time, and they were simply part of what Atlantic service cost. The relationship between the cold, the fear, and the monotony. 3 conditions operating simultaneously, each amplifying the others, produced, in the men who endured them across years of Atlantic service, a particular kind of individual. Not a hero in any theatrical sense, not defined by a single extraordinary moment, but a person who had been tested, consistently and without respite, by conditions that asked for more than ordinary resilience, and who had continued to function effectively through those conditions, because the job required it, and because the ship and the crew around him required it, and because, in the end, there was no alternative. These men came back to civilian life after the war, and, in most cases, returned to the jobs and the families and the ordinary routines they had left. They carried the Atlantic with them in ways that were sometimes visible and sometimes not. The quality that the Atlantic had produced in them was not, in most cases, easily expressible in peacetime terms. But it was real, and it lasted, and it is worth sitting with tonight. Chapter 11. The Turn of the Tide. The spring of 1943 occupies a specific place in the historiography of the Battle of the Atlantic that is, in operational terms, well justified. Something shifted in those months, and the shift was sharp enough to be visible in the statistics in ways that rarely happen in campaigns of this duration. May of 1943 is sometimes called Black May in the German U-boat records. In that single month, the German submarine force lost more than 40 submarines. The precise figure varies slightly depending on the source and how you count damaged as, opposed to sunk, which represented a rate of loss that Grand Admiral Dönitz, in his memoirs and his wartime diary, acknowledged as unsustainable. He withdrew the main U-boat force from the North Atlantic convoy routes at the end of that month, temporarily but significantly, and the withdrawal acknowledged what the operational statistics had already shown, that the balance of the campaign had shifted in a way that simple persistence could not reverse. For the men on the Royal Navy's destroyer escort screens, Black May did not feel, in real time, like a turning point. It felt like a month in which more contacts were being made, more attacks were being pressed to a conclusion, and more U-boats were going down. The pattern was visible in retrospect, in a way it could not quite be in the middle of it. The reasons for the shift in 1943 were multiple and overlapping, which is why the historiographical debate about which factor was most important remains genuinely contested rather than resolved. The closing of the mid-Atlantic air gap, accomplished through the deployment of very long-range aircraft, the Consolidated Liberator in particular, to airfields in Iceland and Newfoundland, removed the area in which convoys had been unprotected from air cover, and the presence of maritime patrol aircraft over a convoy changed the tactical calculus for U-boat commanders dramatically. A submarine that surfaced in the presence of a liberator did not surface for long. The use of escort carriers small aircraft carriers carrying anti-submarine aircraft. Sailing with the convoy escort extended this air cover to routes where shore-based aircraft could not reach, and the escort carrier groups that began operating in the North Atlantic from early 1943 added a dimension to convoy protection that the Wolfpack tactics could not adapt to quickly enough. The escort groups themselves had by early 1943 achieved a degree of experience and cohesion that was qualitatively different from what had been possible in the first 2 years of the war. The concept of the support group, a self-contained escort group that could be deployed to reinforce a threatened convoy without being permanently attached to it, meant that when intelligence indicated that a wolf pack was concentrating against a specific convoy, additional escorts could be dispatched. The availability of this reserve transformed the tactical options available to the convoy escort commander, where, in 1941, he had managed his escort with the knowledge that what he had was all he would get. He could now, in favorable circumstances, call for reinforcement. The support groups included some of the most experienced ships and officers in the Western Approaches Fleet, and their arrival in a threatened convoy screen was, in operational terms, a significant event. For the ordinary rating on a destroyer in the spring of 1943, the turn of the tide manifested in small but perceptible ways. Convoys were getting through more consistently. The ratio of ships lost per convoy was declining. The contacts that the Azdik and the Huffduff were generating were more frequently leading to attack that produced confirmed results. Oil, wreckage, the acoustic signature of a submarine breaking up at depth, rather than the ambiguous outcomes that had characterized too many attacks in the earlier years. There was not a moment of announced victory. There was a gradual shift in the texture of operations that men on the ships felt before they could have articulated it analytically. The war in the Atlantic was not won in the spring of 1943, but the direction in which it was moving had changed, and the direction mattered. It meant that the work the destroyer crews had been doing through the long darkness and the hard winters and the convoys that arrived depleted had not been in vain. The job was working. The U-boat force did not abandon the Atlantic War after May 1943. It adapted, innovated, and returned, with new technology, including the acoustic homing torpedo and improved anti-aircraft armament on the U-boats themselves, and eventually with the schnorkel, which allowed the submarines to run their diesel engines while submerged and reduced their need to surface where radar and aircraft could find them. The campaign in its later phases was therefore not a coda to the decisive events of 1943, but a continuation that required sustained effort from the escort forces through 1944 and into 1945. The losses among Allied shipping continued, at reduced rates, but not at zero. Destroyers continued to be sunk. The schnorkel-equipped U-boat presented different tactical problems than the earlier boats, and the countermeasures required continued development. The spring of 1943 was a turn, not an end, and the distinction for matter understanding what the remaining 2 years of the Atlantic War asked of its participants. The men who had been through the long darkness and survived it into the relatively better conditions of 1943 and 1944 were different in a specific and measurable sense from the men who had joined their ships in 1940. They were more experienced. They were, in most cases, better at their specific jobs. Their ASDIC operators had thousands of hours of operational time and could read a genuine contact against a background of false returns with a reliability that their 1941 counterparts could not match. Their engine room departments could extract performance from worn machinery that the textbooks would have said was unavailable. Their captains, the ones who had survived in command, which was itself a selection process, had been through enough that the unexpected had become, in a limited but real sense, familiar. This accumulation of experience was not evenly distributed. Some ships had high turnover, and some watches contained men who were still learning the basics. But the average level of operational competence in the Atlantic escort forces by mid-1943 was substantially higher than it had been in 1940, and this mattered in ways that are difficult to quantify, but impossible to dismiss. The port routine that punctuated Atlantic service, the periods in Liverpool or Londonderry between convoys, took on a different character in the improved operational climate of the later war years. The frantic urgency of the early period, when ships were turned around as fast as possible, because the losses were running at rates that demanded every available escort at sea, gave way to a somewhat more measured tempo in which ships received more thorough maintenance, and crews received something closer to adequate rest before sailing again. The cinema, the pub, the dance hall, the letter from home. These were the contents of the harbour period, and they provided the human ballast without which the operational cycle could not have been sustained. The men who queued for the cinema on a Tuesday evening in Londonderry in the autumn of 1943 were, within a week, at sea again in the Atlantic. The brief domesticity of the harbour visit was not an interruption to the war. It was what made the continuation of the war possible. The decorations and citations that accumulated during the later years of the campaign, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Distinguished Service Medal, the mention in dispatches, were being awarded to men whose service had begun, in many cases, before the tide turned, and who had been doing the same essential work through the bad years, without recognition, because the bad years had been too busy for the administrative machinery of recognition to function smoothly. This is not a complaint about the system, but an observation about how the formal record of wartime service can systematically underrepresent the earlier portion of a campaign, the portion when the conditions were hardest and the recognition most sparse. The men who received their decorations in 1943 and 1944 were being recognized for the full arc of their service, which included years for which no citation existed. They knew this. The senior officers who wrote the recommendations knew it too. The shift in the Atlantic War's momentum was felt most clearly in one specific statistical measure that the men did not track formally but carried, in a less quantified form, in their professional sense of the campaign's direction. The ratio of Allied merchant ships sunk to U-boats sunk. In the darkest period of the war, this ratio had been deeply unfavourable. Many merchant ships lost for each U-boat destroyed. By the end of 1943, the ratio had inverted. For the first time in the campaign, the U-boat fleet was losing boats at a rate that exceeded its ability to replace them with experienced crews. The men reading the operational summaries, the commanding officers who received the periodic assessments from Western Approaches Command, could see this change in the numbers. What it meant was not that the war was over, but that the arithmetic had changed sides, and the side that now had the arithmetic working for it was the one conducting the convoys. For men who had been doing this for 3 or 4 years, this was not a cause for public celebration. That was not the register the culture ran in. But it was, in its quiet way, something. Chapter 12. Coming Home, and What Stayed. There is a moment that appears in a number of the personal accounts of Royal Navy Atlantic service, not in the official histories, not in the operational reports, but in the memoirs and the letters, where the writer describes arriving home after a long commission and finding that the ordinary world has become, in some sense, he cannot quite explain, difficult to inhabit, not terrible, not incapacitating, but strange. The house that was familiar before the war is familiar in the wrong register. Too still, too quiet, too fixed in a way that a ship is not. The people who love him are where they should be, and he is glad to see them. And the warmth of the reunion is real, and yet there is a discrepancy between where he has been and where he now is, between what the last 18 months have consisted of and what the next few weeks are going to consist of, that takes time, sometimes considerable time, to close. This is not a dramatic or a simple experience to describe, and the men who tried to describe it mostly did so obliquely, in the language of understatement that the Royal Navy and the culture around it had made into a default mode of expression. But the phenomenon itself was consistent enough and specific enough to deserve being named. The return from an Atlantic commission typically involved a period of leave, the length varying with the duration of the commission, and the current operational pressure, followed by a further appointment. Another ship, a shore posting, a training role if the man's experience and the services needs aligned in that direction. For the ratings, the transition was mediated by the shore establishment system. A man returned his ship, collected his leave papers, and disappeared for a period into the civilian world, before reporting to a barracks or depot for his next appointment. For the officers, the pattern was similar in structure, but the appointment process was more individualized. A destroyer captain returning from an Atlantic commission might be given a shore billet in Western Approaches Command, bringing operational experience into the planning and intelligence machinery that he had been benefiting from without knowing its details. Or he might be given another sea command, often a larger ship, as the promotion system registered his Atlantic service. Or he might go to a training establishment where the specific things he had learned at sea were of direct value to the men being prepared for the same work. The leave itself was a complex experience that the personal record documents with more candor than the official record. Men who had been at sea for a year or more and who arrived home on leave were returning to relationships that had continued during their absence in ways they had not been present for. Children had grown. Marriages had been maintained at the distance of letters, and letters, as everyone who has relied on them for a sustained period knows, are not the same as presents. The practical mechanics of domestic life, which the man had not been part of for 12 or 18 months, were in the hands of whoever had been managing them, and the reintegration of a returning sailor into those mechanics was not automatic. The available literature from this period, the letters, the diaries, the memoirs, suggests that most families managed this successfully enough, but the management required effort from both parties. And the effort was not always acknowledged because the language for acknowledging it was not readily available in the culture of the time. The physical rest of leave was something that men took with a seriousness that suggested they had been aware for some time of a debt that needed repaying. The sleep of the first nights at home, in a bed that did not move, in a house that was not making mechanical noise, in a room that was dark, in a way that the ship was rarely dark, was described by multiple veterans as one of the most profound physical experiences of the transition. The body, which had been maintaining itself at a high level of operational readiness for months, could relax in a way it had not allowed itself to do at sea, and the relaxation was total in ways that sometimes alarmed the people witnessing it. Men who had been functioning at sea with apparent ease could find themselves at home on leave, unable to sustain normal social engagement for more than a few hours before the fatigue caught up. This was not weakness. It was the release of a sustained physical tension whose costs were being tallied only now that the sustained stimulus had been removed. The social world that men returned to had been changing during their absence, and not always in directions they had expected or prepared for. The civilian population of Britain in the middle years of the war had its own experience of sustained hardship. The bombing, the rationing, the absences, the anxiety. And the man returning from the Atlantic was returning to people who had been living their own version of the same war, in a different register, but not in comfort or safety. The particular knowledge of the returning sailor, what he had seen, what the convoy losses had actually consisted of, was not something he could easily translate into the common currency of civilian conversation, not because the civilians were unsympathetic, but because the specific texture of the experience did not have available language in the spaces where ordinary life happened. The pub, the front room, the family dinner table. These were not places where the geometry of a depth charge attack or the specific quality of Atlantic cold at 0300 hours could be explained in terms that connected. The men who returned to their ships after leave were, in a practical sense, refreshed. The leave had done what it was intended to do, reset the physical and psychological baseline enough to allow continued effective service. But the return to sea was also, for many men, accompanied by something that was not quite relief but occupied a similar psychological position. The ship had a clarity to it that home, in the middle of the war, did not. On the ship, the roles were clear. The watch bill was clear. What was expected of a man was clear. The ambient anxiety of being at war while at sea was. Chapter 12, Coming Home and What Stayed, Completion. In some ways, simpler to hold. The war at sea had a clarity that peacetime did not yet have, and men returning to ships after leave were returning not just to a vessel and a crew, but to a structure of meaning that the leave period had not been able to fully replace. This is not a romantic observation about the sea. It is a practical one about the human need for coherent context. And it says something significant about what the ship had become over months of shared service for the people aboard it. They knew what they were for there. The same certainty took longer to rebuild ashore. The hostilities only ratings. The men who had no plan to remain in the Navy after the war, who had joined for the duration, and not a day beyond, began, as the campaign moved toward its conclusion in 1944 and 1945, to carry in their heads a version of themselves that was already partly civilian. They were doing the job, continuing the watch, remaining fully operational, and simultaneously inhabiting a future they had been constructing in imagination throughout the commission, the job they were going back to, the house they were going to live in, the rhythms of an ordinary life that now, after years of Atlantic service, felt almost hypothetically peaceful. This dual habitation, fully present on the ship and partly already somewhere else, was not unique to these men, but the hostilities. Only Rating's version of it was particularly acute, because his return to civilian life was not a question, but a certainty, contingent only on the war ending and his survival of it. Both conditions were, by 1944, looking more likely than they had 2 years before. The imagined future was approaching, and the men watched it come. The permanent officers and the long service ratings faced a different transition. The Navy was what they did, and the end of the war would return them not to a civilian life, but to a Navy that would be smaller, slower, and shaped by peacetime priorities that wartime service had not prepared them for. Some of them found this transition easier than others. The men who had joined in the pre-war years and who had spent their formative professional decades in a service defined by the Atlantic Campaign would discover, in the years after 1945, that the peacetime Navy was a quieter and more institutional place, and that the skills and dispositions the Atlantic had developed in them, the rapid decision under pressure, the comfort with uncertainty, the capacity for sustained endurance, were not always the skills the peacetime promotion structure most rewarded. This is not a complaint about the Navy or about the peace. It is an observation about the specific costs of having been formed professionally in a particular kind of crucible and then being required to function in a very different kind of environment. The men who came home, and a meaningful number did not, and their absence shaped the communities they had left in ways that this documentary has not tried to name, because the naming belongs to the people who lived it, carried the Atlantics inside them in ways that were sometimes visible and sometimes not. Some spoke about it readily in the bars and the veterans' clubs and the front rooms of the post-war years, finding in the telling a way to share the weight of what had been endured. Others never mentioned it, or mentioned it only in the oblique language of understatement that the service had taught them, the specific code by which a man indicates that he has been through something, without offering it for examination. Both responses were honest. Both were the product of the same experience, processed through different personalities and different relationships with the task of expression. What they left behind, in the records, in the letters, in the memoirs, that some wrote and many did not, is not a complete picture. No historical record of any human experience is complete. And the Atlantic War, which was fought across an ocean that has no monuments, by men who mostly preferred not to be documented, is less complete than most. What remains is sufficient to understand the shape of it, the cold and the watches, the depth charges and the ASDIC, the convoys and the losses, the rum ration and the hammock and the cup of tea that was always strong and always available, sufficient to understand what it asked of the people who did it and what it produced in them. Sufficient, perhaps, to carry something of it forward into a quieter night, a warmer room, the particular stillness of a house where the worst that has happened today is modest, and the horizon contains nothing more threatening than morning. That gap between where they were and where you are now is worth sitting with for a moment. They would not have asked you to think about them, but they are worth thinking about. Chapter 13. The Western Approach's Tactical Unit. In the autumn of 1941, something unusual happened in the Royal Navy, which was not an institution accustomed to anything it might have described as unusual. A problem was acknowledged officially, with candor, at a level of seniority that made the acknowledgement consequential. The problem was this: the tactics the escort forces were using to protect convoys and hunt submarines were not working well enough, and the analysis of why they were not working well enough pointed to doctrinal failures, rather than to failures of courage or seamanship. This was, in institutional terms, a difficult conclusion to reach, because it required a hierarchical organization to tell itself that the methods it had been teaching and enforcing were inadequate. The Royal Navy reached this conclusion and acted on it with a speed that the subsequent improvement in escort effectiveness confirms was genuine rather than cosmetic. The mechanism through which it acted was the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, established in January 1942 in Liverpool, and what this unit did is one of the more interesting institutional stories of the Atlantic Campaign. The unit was established at the direction of Western Approaches Command, by this point operating from Derby House in Liverpool, under Admiral Sir Percy Noble, in response to a fundamental question that the escort force could not yet answer satisfactorily. When a ship was torpedoed in a convoy at night, when the flash and the column of water announced that a U-boat had got inside the screen, what did the escorts actually do? The commanding officer, Captain Gilbert Roberts, who had been retired from the active list on medical grounds before the war, and brought back for this specific purpose, began by asking that question directly to escort commanders as they came into Liverpool. His own account of what he was told is quoted in the operational literature with some frequency, and it captures the nature of the problem precisely. The commanders described going to action stations, increasing speed, taking bearings, all of which was procedurally correct and tactically insufficient. No one had a systematic answer to where the U-boat had gone or how to find it again, because no one had worked out systematically how the U-boat had got in. Roberts's central analytical contribution, made possible by a willingness to challenge assumptions that experienced officers had been making without examination, was the recognition that the U-boats were not firing from outside the convoy screen, but from inside it. They were infiltrating from astern, where the screen was thinnest and the geometry of detection most difficult, and firing at close range from within the columns of merchant ships themselves. This was when demonstrated on the tactical floor that Watteau constructed in Derby House, a large-scale physical model of a convoy moved by the Women's Royal Naval Service officers and ratings who staffed the unit, immediately visible in a way that the verbal description alone had not been. The tactical doctrine that Roberts developed from this insight, the systematic response to a night attack that would drive the infiltrating U-boat back out of the convoy and into a position where it could be attacked, was then taken back to sea by the escort commanders who had been through the Watteau training. The results in the subsequent operational record were measurable. The Western Approaches Tactical Unit occupied a top floor in Derby House and was staffed almost entirely by women. RAN's officers and ratings who ran the tactical exercises, managed the floor model, and contributed to the analytical work of developing and refining the doctrines being taught. This aspect of Watteau's story has received somewhat more attention in recent years than it did in the immediate post-war histories, and the institutional acknowledgement of the contribution these women made to the tactical improvement of the Atlantic escort forces has been slow in arriving. The officers who came through Watteau's training were in most cases introduced to the unit's methods by the same RAN's officers who had built the floor model and designed the exercises, and the quality of what they were being taught was a direct reflection of the analytical and educational work those officers had put into it. The formal doctrine that went to sea with the escort commanders had been developed, tested, and refined on the Watteau floor before it ever reached a ship, and the floor was run by women who understood the problem, at least, as well as the men they were training. The process by which Watteau generated tactical doctrine was itself institutionally notable. Roberts had the formal authority, as a captain in the Royal Navy hierarchy, to develop and disseminate tactical doctrine, and he exercised it. But the substance of what he disseminated was the product of a method that was, by the standards of the service, relatively unusual. the systematic collection of operational experience from escort commanders, the analytical decomposition of tactical problems, the testing of proposed solutions on the floor model before they were issued as doctrine, and the continuous feedback loop that brought the results of sea operations back into the training program. This was not how naval doctrine had traditionally been developed. It was how it needed to be developed in a campaign that was changing rapidly, where the enemy was adapting and the tools were evolving, and the doctrine that was adequate this month might not be adequate next month. The escort commanders who came through Watu, and they came in rotating groups as ships arrived in port and were cycled through the program, returned to sea with something specific that they had not had before: a common tactical language and a common doctrinal framework that allowed ships from different escort groups to work together without the costly improvisation of the early war period. The importance of this shared framework cannot be overstated in the context of Atlantic operations, where support groups were being deployed to reinforce threatened convoys, and where the arriving ships needed to integrate into an existing escort's operations without extensive preliminary communication. If the incoming ships knew the same procedures, spoke the same tactical language, and had been trained to the same doctrine, the integration was faster and more effective. Watu created the conditions for this. The operational record of the escort groups in the second half of the war reflects in the improved coordination of complex anti-submarine operations what that creation had made possible. The Watu's doctrines addressed not only how escorts should respond to attacks, but how escort groups should be commanded and how authority should be distributed within a group under pressure. The command philosophy that Roberts and Walker had been developing independently. The idea that escort commanders should have the authority to act without awaiting orders from shore. That initiative at the point of contact was more valuable than coordination from a distance, was formalized in the doctrinal documents that Watu produced and disseminated. This ran against the institutional reflex of a centralized naval hierarchy, and it required the backing of senior officers who understood that the alternative, holding initiative back in the hands of shore headquarters, was producing the kind of results that had characterized the early years of the campaign. The backing came through Admiral Noble, and subsequently through his successor, Admiral Sir Max Horton, who took command of Western approaches in November 1942, and who drove the institutional evolution of the escort forces with a directness that the period urgently required. The Enigma blackout of February 1942, when the German Navy introduced a new variation of its cipher system that Bletchley Park could not read for approximately 10 months, removed, for that period, the intelligence support that had been routing convoys away from U-boat concentrations. The losses during this period were severe. Allied merchant shipping, sunk in 1942, was more than 56% higher than in 1941, by the most reliable estimates. For the men on the destroyer escorts, this period felt different from what had preceded it in ways that are difficult to articulate, but that the operational record confirms. More contacts, more attacks, more losses in convoy, a sense that the tactical tools were being worked harder against a more intense threat. The Watu doctrines were being applied. The radar and the Huff-Duff were being used. But the intelligence advantage that had been partially compensating for numerical inadequacy was temporarily absent, and the difference showed. The men kept working. The convoys kept moving. The arithmetic of the period was grim, and the men doing the escort knew it was grim. and the knowing did not change the requirement to continue. The relationship between the institutional learning that Watu represented and the actual tactical performance of the escort forces at sea was not automatic or instantaneous. Doctrine leaves Derby House as a set of procedures. It arrives at sea as a set of officers and ratings who have been through the training program and are now required to apply it in conditions that the tactical floor could only approximate. The translation between the two required the kind of operational discipline that could only be developed through practice, and practice in this context meant actual convoys in actual Atlantic weather with actual U-boat contacts to manage. The escort groups that had been together longest, that had worked the doctrine through multiple operational cycles, performed measurably better than groups where the training was recent or the composition had recently changed. This is not a surprising finding. It is the predictable product of how complex operational skills are developed. But it matters for understanding why the improvement in escort effectiveness was gradual rather than instantaneous, and why the spring of 1943 represented the accumulation of more than a year of institutional work rather than a sudden tactical revolution. By the middle years of the war, the Western Approach's tactical unit had trained a significant proportion of the officers commanding North Atlantic convoy escorts, and its doctrinal influence was present, in various degrees of fidelity, across the escort forces of Western Approach's command. The specific tactical ideas it had developed, the responses to night attacks, the command philosophy of devolved initiative, the systematic approach to the classification of contacts, had become, through training and operational use, the common property of the escort force, rather than the innovation of a single unit. This is the mark of successful institutional learning. Not that a clever person found a better way, but that the better way became the standard way, absorbed into the organization, and reproduced by people who learned it from practice rather than from the original insight. The Battle of the Atlantic was won, insofar as a campaign of this duration can be said to have been won, through the accumulation of exactly this kind of institutional improvement. Unglamorous, incremental, and absolutely indispensable. Chapter 14. The Schnorkel and the Last Year. The conventional account of the Battle of the Atlantic ends, in most popular tellings, in May of 1943. The wolf packs withdraw. The losses fall. The victory is declared. This is accurate as far as it goes, but it goes significantly less far than the historical record actually extends, and the men on the Royal Navy, destroyers in the North Atlantic, in the autumn of 1944 and the spring of 1945, were not operating in a concluded campaign. They were operating in a campaign that had changed character, that had become harder to read. Precisely because the tools that had made the middle years' victories possible were now less effective against an enemy that had adapted in a specific and technically significant way. The adaptation was the Schnorkel, a device that allowed a diesel-powered U-boat to run its engines while submerged, breathing through a tube extended to just above the surface, and it changed the nature of the remaining war at sea in ways that historians are still, in the honest literature of the campaign, working through. The Schnorkel, as a concept, was not new when the Germans introduced it operationally in the second half of 1943 and through 1944. The Dutch Navy had been experimenting with a similar device before the fall of the Netherlands. In 1940, and captured Dutch submarines provided the German engineers with material to work from. The operational significance of the Schnorkel was this. A U-boat equipped with it no longer needed to surface to recharge its batteries or to run its diesel engines. It could remain below the surface almost indefinitely, surfacing briefly, only to snorkel at periscope depth. And a submarine at periscope depth running snorkel was very difficult to detect by the tools that have been most effective against the surfaced or the shallow running U-boat in the middle years of the campaign. Radar was less effective at detecting the small cross-section of a snorkel head than it had been at detecting a surfaced submarine. Aircraft, which had been decisive in closing the mid-Atlantic air gap, had much reduced effectiveness against a target they could not reliably see. The intelligence from decrypted signals, which had been used to route convoys away from U-boat concentrations, was less useful against boats that were transmitting far less, because the snorkel removed the need to surface for extended periods. And surfacing had been when most transmitting happened. The snorkel's impact on the British coastal campaign of late 1944 and into 1945 was assessed in real time with a frankness that the official wartime documents record, but that popular histories have largely failed to relay. Captain Clarence Howard Johnson, serving as the Royal Navy's director of the Anti-U-Boat Division, stated in November 1944 that the snorkel had so altered the character of the U-boat war that its whole balance had shifted in the enemy's favor. That snorkel-equipped boats had managed, with some regularity, to penetrate convoy routes in focal areas close to British ports and remain there in spite of intensive surface and air patrols. This was not a marginal assessment from a cautious official. It was a direct acknowledgement by a senior officer in the relevant directorate that the tools which had prevailed in the mid-ocean campaign were struggling against the inshore, submerged threat. For the men on the destroyers conducting those surface patrols, this acknowledgement confirmed what operational experience had already suggested. The job had changed, and the change was not to their advantage. The inshore campaign of the last year was a different kind of war from the mid-Atlantic convoy battles of 1942. The snorkel boats were operating in shallower water, closer to British ports and convoy assembly areas, in channels and focal points, where the acoustic environment was more complex, and the margin for error in ASDIC interpretation was correspondingly tighter. The thermal layers that had complicated ASDIC work in the open Atlantic were present in different configurations in coastal waters, and the shallower depths meant that a U-boat had less room to maneuver in the vertical dimension that had sometimes allowed it to evade depth charge attacks in deep water. But the snorkel boat that maintained strict radio silence, that did not surface, that moved slowly and patiently to a position where the traffic was densest, was a very difficult target to find before it attacked. The destroyers and frigates conducting the inshore patrols were applying the Watu doctrines, using improved equipment and operating with the accumulated experience of years of Atlantic service. They were still, in this specific context, operating in conditions of genuine tactical difficulty that the popular end-of-the-war narrative does not fully capture. The Type XI U-boat, the large, high-capacity electro-boat that Dönitz had been developing as the successor to the conventional diesel submarines, was, from the Allied perspective, the threat that kept Western approaches to guns planning under pressure through the final year. The Type X1 could travel faster underwater than most escort vessels could manage, could dive deeper, carried a larger torpedo complement, and incorporated the snorkel as standard. Had it entered service in meaningful numbers before the end of the war, the nature of the late war campaign could have been significantly different. In the event, production difficulties, partly the result of Allied bombing of manufacturing facilities, partly the result of the ambitious modular construction method chosen for the program, delayed its operational deployment until the last weeks of the war and the Allied victory in Europe came before the Type XXX-1 fleet could be deployed at scale. The assessment of what might have happened had the timeline been different is, in the historical literature, one of those counterfactual debates that historians engage with carefully and without resolution because the variables are too numerous to model reliably. For the destroyers conducting patrols off the English and Scottish coasts in the winter of 1944 to 45, the daily reality was characterized by a specific kind of operational patience. The contacts were less frequent than in the mid-Atlantic peak years, but were more localized and in many cases more difficult to resolve. A snorkel-equipped U-boat in shallow coastal water could be confused, acoustically, with a number of bottom features and biological targets that the open Atlantic did not present in the same way. The ASDIC operators were working at the highest level of their skill, accumulated over years of operational service, and they were still dealing with contacts whose classification required time and experience, and a willingness to commit to an attack that might or might not be confirmed. The commanding officers were applying all of the tactical doctrine that vital and operational experience had developed in water that the doctrine had not been designed for. They were adapting as they went, which is what the entire Atlantic campaign had always required, and they were doing it with the specific competence of people who had been adapting to the same enemy for 5 years. The losses continued through this period, at rates lower than the dark years, but not at zero. HMS Maratha, a destroyer, was sunk on the 25th of February 1944 on the Arctic convoy run by a torpedo from a U-boat operating in waters that were, by any objective measure, some of the most hostile for human survival on the planet. The Arctic convoys, supplying the Soviet Union through the northern route, past Norway to Murmansk, operated in conditions that made the North Atlantic seem, comparatively, moderate. Temperatures that made everything metal aboard the ship dangerous to touch with bare skin, sea states that produced icing of topside equipment and superstructure, and a threat environment that included German surface ships, aircraft operating from Norwegian airfields, and U-boats, all in waters where the hours of darkness in winter were such that the convoy was operating in near-permanent blackness. The destroyers on the Arctic run carried the same essential character as their Atlantic counterparts, doing the same essential job, in conditions that were in several respects significantly worse. The German Navy's surface threat, the battleship Tirpitz, lying in Norwegian fjords for much of the war, periodically threatening convoy routes by her mere presence, influenced how the escort forces were organized and what resources the Admiralty had to allocate to different tasks. Even when the Tirpitz was not actually at sea, the threat in being, the possibility that the ship might sortie, required a response that tied up capital ships and planning attention that might otherwise have been available for the convoy war. The Tirpitz was ultimately sunk by Royal Air Force bombers in November 1944 on the 12th of that month in Tromsø Fjord, using 12,000-pound tallboy bombs. For the destroyer crews, the removal of the surface threat simplified the strategic picture, even as the snorkel threat was complicating the tactical one. These two trends, the declining surface threat and the increasing inshore U-boat challenge, were the defining features of the Atlantic War's final phase and they ran concurrently in ways that the officers managing the campaign had to hold in their heads simultaneously. The intelligence picture in the last year was more complicated than it had been in the period of peak Enigma decryption success. The introduction of the Courier burst transmission system by the German Navy, a system designed to compress radio messages into very short transmissions that were difficult to intercept and impossible to analyze by conventional means in real time, reduced the value of signals intercepts for tracking U-boat movements. The Schnorkel boat's operational profile, which involved minimal surface time and reduced radio transmissions, further limited the intelligence available. The Allied response was to increase the density of patrols in focal areas and to develop better acoustic detection methods for the conditions of coastal water. This was operationally expensive in terms of ships and aircraft and fuel, and it produced results that were adequate but not decisive. The final assessment of the U-boat force's operational status, made by Allied analysts in the last days of April 1945, found over 190 U-boats at sea or in port, with significant numbers still active. The war in the Atlantic, from the perspective of the men conducting it, had not ended before it ended. The news of the German surrender on the 8th of May 1945 reached ships at sea in various ways and at various times, and the accounts of how destroyer crews received it reflect the full range of human response to the end of a very long ordeal. Some celebrated with the energy of people who had been maintaining a sustained and demanding effort for years and could now release it. Some found the moment strange and quiet, not easily expressed in the obvious emotional registers that the occasion might seem to demand. Some were focused on the immediate practicalities. The standing orders for the acceptance of surrendering U-boats, the procedures for the cessation of offensive operations, the administrative machinery of standing down from a war footing that was itself a demanding and unfamiliar task after years in which the war footing had been the only footing they knew. All of them, in their different ways, had arrived at a point that many of them, at various moments over the preceding 5 or 6 years, had been unable to feel certain of reaching. They were still there. The ship was still afloat. The convoy had come through. Chapter 15. Ordinary days. Extraordinary steadiness. There is a risk, in any account of a military campaign, of constructing the story so entirely around the dramatic episodes that the ordinary disappears. And the ordinary is, almost always, where the actual experience of the campaign lived. The Battle of the Atlantic was, for the men of the Royal Navy destroyer escorts, predominantly constituted of days when nothing happened that a historian would record. Transits that were uneventful, convoys that arrived complete, watches that produced no contacts, patrols that generated nothing more remarkable than an entry in the deck, log noting the sea state and the time of the watch change. These days, the unremarkable days, were not easy. They were cold, they were long, they were conducted in a ship that was always moving, and sometimes moving violently, and they required the same level of attention and the same level of professional discipline as the days when the wolf pack arrived. They were simply not the days that end up in the accounts. And because they don't end up in the accounts, the aggregate weight of them tends to disappear from the story. It is worth reconstructing one of these ordinary days. Not any particular documented day, but a composite of what the records, the memoirs, and the operational logs describe as typical. Because the composite reveals something important about the quality of life these men were actually living. A mid-Atlantic transit in the winter of 1942. Weather moderate, convoy of 43 merchant ships, escort of 2 destroyers and 4 corvettes. The morning watch is running, the convoy making 7.5 knots on a north-northeast course. The watch officer on the bridge, a sub-lieutenant, 22 years old, RNVR, qualified 6 months ago, has been on the bridge since 0400 hours and will hand over at 0800. The temperature is a few degrees above freezing. The spray from the bow wave reaches the bridge regularly. He has a cup of tea that was hot when it arrived and is now something else. The ASDIC operator below is cycling through his sweeps. The radar, fitted 3 months ago, still being learned, is showing the convoy formation clearly. There are no contacts of interest. The watch officer is scanning the horizon with binoculars on a rhythm that has become automatic. He is doing this correctly and professionally. He is also at some level below the operational, cold and tired, and aware of exactly how many hours are left in this watch. The morning watch handover at 0800 hours is brief and businesslike. The outgoing watch officer briefs the incoming officer on course, speed, sea state, any contacts during the watch. There were none, and the state of the equipment. The incoming officer is a lieutenant, 26, regular Navy, 3 years of Atlantic service. He takes the binoculars. The watch officer goes below. He eats from the galley, which this morning has produced porridge. The oats are dried. The result is functional, and a mug of tea. He writes 3 lines in a letter home that he has been composing intermittently for the past week. He reads 8 pages of a novel that has been circulating through the mess for the past month. He is in his hammock within 40 minutes of leaving the bridge. He is asleep within 3 minutes of getting into the hammock. This is not drama. This is what the day consists of. At 1400 hours, the ASDIC operator on the afternoon watch reports a possible contact on the starboard bow. The commanding officer is called to the bridge. The escort increases speed and turns toward the bearing. The ASDIC operator, he has been at this work for 18 months and his readings are reliable, maintains the contact for 4 minutes and then loses it. The ship makes 3 more sweeps of the area at reduced speed. The contact does not return. The classification is uncertain. Possible fish, shoal, possible bottom feature, possible genuine contact that has gone deep and is maintaining silence. The commanding office makes a judgment. It is always a judgment, never a certainty, and resumes station on the convoy. The entry in the deck log reads, possible ASDIC contact, investigated, not confirmed. This is the full record of an event that, for the men involved, occupied 40 minutes of heightened attention, and then was absorbed back into the routine of the afternoon. No ships were sunk. No U-boat was found. No depth charges were used. Nothing happened in the operational sense. But something was happening continuously. The maintenance of a defensive posture by tired and cold men on behalf of 43 merchant ships that arrived at their destination without incident because nobody aboard them ever knew they had been protected. The small rituals of shipboard life provided the anchors around which the day's routine organized itself. The rum issue at noon, precise, ceremonious in its small way, conducted in the presence of the petty officer and consumed on the spot, was not simply a caloric supplement. It was a moment, predictable in an environment of uncertainty, that arrived at the same time every day and required the same sequence of actions, regardless of the sea, state, or the tactical situation. It was, in a modest and entirely practical way, a piece of stability that the men could rely on. The meals, similarly, even the mediocre ones, even the tinned meat and the hard biscuit of the mid-Atlantic transit, were fixed points in the day Moments when the duty clock could be set aside for the 20 minutes required to eat, when the social dynamics of the mess were briefly primary rather than secondary to the operational rhythm. The men complained about the food because complaining about the food was one of the constant and reliable social activities of naval service, and the complaining was a form of normalcy, a reminder that ordinary life still had its ordinary standards. Even out here, the maintenance routines that occupied the off-watch periods, cleaning the gun barrels, checking the depth charge release mechanisms, testing the communication circuits, servicing the ASDIC dome, were not bureaucratic formalities. They were the practical foundation on which operational reliability rested. A gun that was not cleaned and maintained did not fire when required, and a gun that did not fire when required was a gun that could cost lives. The men who performed this maintenance understood its purpose with a clarity that peacetime maintenance routines, conducted without operational stakes, do not produce. The work was often dull. The cold made it more difficult. The motion of the ship made it more difficult still. And it was done consistently and thoroughly because the alternative, a ship that was operationally unreliable when the situation required reliability, was not acceptable. This is what professional pride looks like in practice. Not the dramatic gesture, but the thorough completion of a cold and dull task in a moving ship on the correct schedule because the task matters. The social life of the ship, the card games, the conversation, the occasional film in harbour, the music that the ratings organised among themselves, was not supplementary to the operational mission. It was part of what made the operational mission sustainable over the years that it lasted. Men who had nothing to do but work and wait would have broken under the cumulative pressure in ways that had operational consequences. The mess deck's social life was the release valve, the mechanism by which the accumulated tension of Atlantic service found a managed outlet, and its importance was understood intuitively by the experienced petty officers and leading hands who organized and maintained it. The card games were competitive enough to be absorbing, and not so serious as to generate destructive conflict. The conversation covered the full range of what men talk about when they are young and confined and aware of their own mortality. The past, the future, the people they had left behind, the plans they were making, the things they were going to do when this was over, the specific immediate present of a moving ship in a grey sea, several hundred miles from land, was the one topic the conversation most reliably avoided because the present was everywhere, and the conversation was specifically for going somewhere else. The relationship between physical hardship and psychological resilience, which the Atlantic campaign tested with extraordinary consistency, is something that the published memoir literature returns to repeatedly without ever quite resolving. Men endure more than they think they can endure. This is not a consolation. It is, in the moment of endurance, a fact that is not yet available to the person experiencing the difficulty, but it is consistently demonstrated across the personal accounts of Atlantic service that the capacity for endurance was larger than the men themselves anticipated, and that it expanded in response to the demand. The cold that felt intolerable in the first month of Atlantic service was the same cold that was merely uncomfortable in the 12th month. The watch that felt impossibly long at the beginning of a commission was a watch of manageable length by the end of it. This is not the same as saying that the conditions were acceptable. It is saying that human beings are more adaptable than their circumstances, sometimes allow them to know, and that the ordinary days of the Atlantic campaign demonstrated this adaptability in ways that are worth honoring even when they are not dramatic. The men who kept these ordinary days, who stood the morning watch in January, who maintained the Aztec through a quiet afternoon, who completed the maintenance, and ate the tinned meal, and played the card game, and wrote the 3 lines of the letter, were not, in those moments, doing anything that the official record would preserve or that the broader history would retain. They were simply doing their job day after day, in a ship on a grey sea, at a speed determined by the slowest merchantman in the convoy, in conditions that asked for steadiness rather than brilliance, and received it. The steadiness is the record. It is, in its accumulated weight, the most significant thing about the campaign, and it deserves to be named before the broader story moves on to its conclusion. Chapter 16. The Men Alongside. Allies, Canadians, and the wider escort force. The story of the Royal Navy in the Atlantic is, necessarily, incomplete if it is told in isolation from the wider Allied effort of which it was part. By the middle years of the war, the convoy escort system in the North Atlantic was an international operation of considerable complexity, involving not only the Royal Navy, but the Royal Canadian Navy, the United States Navy from December 1941 onward, and the naval forces of the Allied governments in exile, the Free French, the Poles, the Norwegians, the Dutch, who contributed ships and crews to the escort forces while their own countries were under occupation. The character of this multinational effort and the human texture of what it meant for men of different services and different national traditions to work alongside each other in the confined spaces of a convoy escort operation is one of the less examined dimensions of the Atlantic campaign, and it opens into questions about identity, communication, and the functional culture that shared danger produces. The Royal Canadian Navy's expansion during the Second World War was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable institutional transformations of the conflict. At the outbreak of the war, the RCN was a small, professional force of modest size. By the peak of the Atlantic campaign, it had become the 3rd largest navy among the Allied powers, measured by number of escort vessels, and was responsible for a significant proportion of North Atlantic convoy escort operations, particularly in the Western and Central Atlantic. The speed of this expansion created the same training and readiness challenges that the Royal Navy itself had faced, and the Canadian escort forces of the early war period were, by the honest assessment of the available sources, including the official Canadian naval histories, sometimes operating at levels of effective competence below what the tactical situation demanded. This is not a criticism of the individuals involved. It is what happens when an institution is required to expand faster than its training and support infrastructure can support, and it is a challenge the Canadians addressed with considerable institutional energy over the middle years of the war. The relationship between Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy crews, when they operated in the same escort group, was shaped by the specific institutional character of the two services. Similar in structure and professional culture, differentiated by the degree to which the RCN had developed its own distinctly national character in the course of the wartime expansion. Canadian crews were, by a number of accounts, somewhat less bound by the formal hierarchical customs of the Royal Navy, more likely to find informal solutions to institutional problems, and in some cases more directly expressive about the conditions under which they were operating. Whether these characteristics were advantages or disadvantages depended on the specific situation and the specific officers involved. What both services shared, and what overrode the institutional differences in the operational sphere, was the job. The same watches, the same weather, the same ASDIC, the same convoys, the same losses. The shared experience of that specific work produced a functional solidarity that the peacetime distinctions between the two services would not have predicted. The Poles who served in the Royal Navy. Crews of Polish destroyers operating under Royal Navy Operational Command, having escaped to British ports after the fall of Poland, brought to the Atlantic escort work a specific and intense motivation that several British officers noted in their accounts. Men whose country had been under occupation since September 1939, who had no home to return to in any practical sense while the war continued, who were fighting for something that existed at the time of their fighting only as a memory and a commitment, had a relationship with the stakes of the campaign that was different in quality from that of men whose families were, however anxiously, in an unoccupied country. The Polish ships, ORP Piorun among them, which famously engaged the Bismarck in May 1941, before the battleship was sunk, operated as part of the escort forces with a professional competence that earned the respect of the Royal Navy officers alongside whom they served. The men aboard them were not doing the same thing as their British counterparts in any superficial sense. They were doing it for different reasons, and the reasons mattered, and the men around them knew it. The Free French and the Norwegians contributed to the Atlantic escort force in ways that the popular narrative of the campaign rarely highlights, but that the operational record confirms were real. Norwegian destroyers, crewed by men who had escaped the German occupation of Norway in 1940, operated on the convoy routes with professional competence that reflected the strong maritime tradition of their country and the specific individual determination of men who had chosen to continue fighting rather than accommodate the occupation. The French naval forces, complicated in their institutional character by the split between the Free French under de Gaulle and the Vichy Navy, contributed ships and crews to the Western Approaches escort forces that served the same convoys alongside British and Canadian vessels. The multinational composition of the escort groups was, in the operational documents, simply noted as a fact of force composition. In the human experience of the men involved, it was a more complex and vivid reality. The polyglot conversations on the bridge circuits, the different culinary traditions meeting in harbour, the occasional breakdown of communication that shared professional culture and individual goodwill had to bridge. The United States Navy's entry into the Atlantic War after the 7th of December 1941 introduced a force of considerable eventual capability and, in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, some significant tactical vulnerabilities. The American coastal waters became, in the first months of 1942, the site of a campaign of U-boat sinkings that has sometimes been described in the operational histories as a second happy time for the German submarine force. Merchant ships sailing independently along the US East Coast, not yet under convoy discipline, against a defensive force that was not yet organized to protect them. The learning that the Royal Navy had accumulated through 2 years of Atlantic campaigning had to be transmitted to the American naval officers, now taking on the same task. And this transmission was not seamless or instantaneous. It happened through liaison and through the shared operational experience of mixed allied escort groups, and the American contribution to the Atlantic campaign grew substantially in capability through 1942 and 1943. By the latter year, the US Navy was operating escort carrier groups and hunter-killer forces that were among the most effective anti-submarine forces in the campaign. For the British destroyer rating, who watched a United States Navy vessel come alongside in Londonderry or Liverpool, the relationship had all the complexity of a close acquaintance recently established under unusual circumstances. There were differences of culture, of pay. American service personnel were paid at rates that British ratings found striking when the comparison was made explicit, and of service, tradition. There was the mutual respect of people doing the same dangerous job in the same ocean, which cut through cultural and institutional differences with an efficiency that the specific shared context of convoy escort uniquely enabled. There was, in some cases, the specific friction of organizations with different procedures being required to work together before those procedures had been fully harmonized. And there was the straightforward human interest of people from different backgrounds meeting in a place that neither had grown up expecting to be. The wartime Atlantic was full of these encounters between nationalities, between classes, between men whose peacetime lives would never have brought them within speaking distance of each other. And the documentary record of what those encounters produced is richer and more varied than the single nation focus of most naval histories suggests. The merchant mariners themselves, the men aboard the ships the destroyers were protecting, deserve a sustained acknowledgement, even in a documentary whose focus is the warship crews. The merchant sailor in the Second World War held a civilian status that placed him outside the formal military hierarchy, while simultaneously exposing him to risks that were statistically comparable to or greater than those faced by the military personnel whose job it was to protect him. The Merchant Navy's losses, more than 30,000 British merchant mariners dead, with the global Allied total substantially higher, were proportionally among the highest of any group engaged in the war, and the men who served on the tankers and the freighters and the troop carriers that the convoys consisted of did so without the institutional support structure, the unit cohesion, and the formal recognition that the warship crews could draw on. The destroyer rating who understood, as he stood his watch, that the 40 ships astern of him contained men in a comparably difficult position without the weapons or the tactical mobility of the warship, was aware of a relationship of obligation that shaped the character of his work in ways that simple duty did not fully capture. The Atlantic War was, when its full multinational scope is acknowledged, one of the most genuinely collective efforts of the Second World War. Not in the way that alliance politics constructs collective efforts, not as a formal agreement between governments, but in the immediate, practical sense that men of different nations, different languages, different institutional traditions, and different personal histories found themselves doing the same job, in the same ocean, in the same conditions, for the same purpose. The purpose was simple and real, that the ships get through. Everything else, the strategic calculus, the political significance, the long-term consequences for the shape of the world, was real too, but distant. At the level of the watch officer on the bridge and the ASDIC operator, with the headphones and the stoker in the engine room, the purpose was immediate and local and completely clear. The ships needed to get through. And across 6 years of effort by men of many nations, they did. Chapter 17. What the Ocean Took and What It Gave. The North Atlantic keeps its records in ways that are not the same as the records kept in archives and official histories. The ocean does not distinguish between the significant and the incidental. It does not curate. Ships went down in it, and the ocean received them with complete indifference. And what the ocean did not return belongs now to a depth where the temperature is a few degrees above freezing, and the darkness is absolute. And permanent. The names of the ships are in the records. The names of the men aboard them are, where the records were kept and kept carefully in lists that family members have searched. The accounting is necessarily incomplete because some ships went down with everyone aboard, and no report was ever filed, and no next of kin was ever found, and the ocean holds those men in the specific anonymity of a very large space and a very long time. The total cost of the Battle of the Atlantic, in the most reliable accounting available, was enormous. Allied merchant shipping losses exceeded 14 million gross tons across the full duration of the campaign. More than 30,000 British merchant mariners were killed. The warship losses on the Allied side were substantial. Destroyers, corvettes, frigates, and sloops sunk by torpedo, mine, aircraft, and weather across 6 years of operations. On the German side, the U-boat arm lost, by the most commonly cited figure, approximately 780 U-boats sunk or destroyed, with losses of life among the U-boat crews that were proportionally among the highest of any military service on either side of the war. More than 70% of the men who served in the German submarine arm died in the course of the campaign. This last figure is not offered in a spirit of comparison or competitive suffering. It is offered because understanding the full human cost of the Atlantic War on all sides is part of understanding what kind of war it actually was, as opposed to what kind of war the framing of victory and defeat tends to construct it as. The Royal Navy's destroyer losses in the Atlantic and adjacent waters were spread across the full duration of the campaign, from the first year to the last. Ships were lost in conditions ranging from the dramatic, a surface action, a wolf-pack attack on a convoy, to the quietly terrible, a mine in the swept channel of a harbour approach, a structural failure in extreme weather, an aircraft attack on a ship that had no warning and no effective response. The records of these losses are in the Navy lists and the operational histories, and the specific numbers of men lost with each ship are there for those who look for them. What is harder to find, and what the memoirs and the letters and the interviews with survivors provide in partial form, is the texture of what those losses meant to the men who witnessed them. A ship that you have been alongside in harbour for 3 weeks, whose officers you know by name, whose crew includes men you have worked with on exercises and shared a mess with in port, goes down at night, and you are in the area, and you search for survivors, and you find some, and you do not find others. The mathematics of this experience, common, repeated across the escort forces through 6 years, is not amenable to summary, and the men who experienced it did not generally try to summarize it. The physical environment of the North Atlantic was in itself one of the campaign's casualties in a way that is rarely discussed. The ocean takes a toll on ships that is distinct from combat damage. The corrosion of salt water on steel, the mechanical wear of sustained high-speed operations in heavy seas, the structural fatigue of a hull working continuously in conditions it was designed to tolerate, but not to inhabit without respite. Destroyers that had been in Atlantic service for 2 or 3 years required repair and maintenance that the wartime yards could provide only partially, because the same yards were building new ships at the same time and managing the workload of all the ships simultaneously damaged. The engineering departments of the older ships became expert in making limited dockyarding go as far as possible in finding ways to maintain operational capability with machinery that was, by strict engineering standards, overdue for attention. This was part of the long-form cost of the campaign. Not the dramatic loss of a ship, but the slow accumulation of wear and maintenance debt on the ships that continued. The men the Atlantic gave back, the survivors, the rescued, the crews of torpedoed merchantmen, and of the occasional warship that went down and was close enough to another vessel for the rescue to work, carried the experience of their time in the water in ways that varied enormously between individuals. The North Atlantic in winter is cold enough to cause incapacitation very quickly. The time available before the cold prevents a man from helping himself was, in the worst conditions, measured in minutes rather than hours, and the experience of being in it, even briefly, even successfully, was not something the body forgot. Men who had been rescued from the water of the Atlantic winter were physically recovered by the skills of the naval medical arrangements and the warmth of the receiving ship, and they returned to sea service, in many cases, within weeks. Whether they were psychologically recovered in any full sense is a harder question, and the personal accounts suggest that the answer was, for most of them, partial at best. What the ocean gave, beyond the losses and the costs, was more difficult to name in the moment than it became in retrospect. It gave the men who endured it a specific and durable sense of their own capacity, not the abstract confidence of a person who has been told they are capable, but the concrete knowledge of a person who has discovered, in the course of actually doing something very hard, that they are capable of it. This is different from anything the shore could have produced, and it lasted. Men who had spent 3 years on Atlantic destroyers, who had kept watches in force 10 gales, and pressed depth charge attacks on uncertain contacts and rescued men from the water at night, and stood their next watch after that, knew something about themselves that was not available in any other way. The knowledge was specific and personal, and did not translate easily into the broader currencies of civilian achievement. But it was real, and it was their own, and no subsequent reduction in their circumstances could take it from them. The ocean also gave, and this is something the accounts return to with a consistency that demands acknowledgement, a particular quality of attention to the natural world. Men who have spent years watching a horizon, scanning water for the meaning of a dark patch or a change in the swell pattern, whose survival has depended on reading the sea's surfaces for information that the sea does not voluntarily provide, develop a relationship with the natural environment that is not romantic. It is not the tourist's admiration for the dramatic. It is the working knowledge of a person for whom the sea was a medium to be understood operationally. Its thermal layers and its weather systems, and its acoustic properties, and its capacity for concealment, and its capacity for sudden total violence. Men who had this knowledge were, in the years after the war, sometimes still observed standing at the margins of water, at harbours, on cliff tops, at the edges of rivers, looking at it with the specific attentiveness of people for whom looking at water had once been the most important thing they did. The sea had their attention in a way that it does not have most people's, and it kept it. The historical memory of the Battle of the Atlantic has, in the 80 years since the campaign concluded, followed a trajectory that historians of collective memory can describe with some confidence. The immediate post-war years produced the first wave of official and personal accounts, shaped by the concerns of people who had just been through it and who were processing the experience in the immediate aftermath. The decades that followed produced a more analytical historiography, as documents were declassified and scholars gained access to materials that had not been available to the first wave of writers. The intelligence dimension of the campaign, the Enigma story, the contribution of Bletchley Park, became publicly known only in the 1970s, and the reassessment of how the Atlantic battle had been fought that followed this revelation was substantial, and in places controversial. Each wave of scholarship has revised the picture in ways that previous accounts had not anticipated, and there is no strong reason to believe that the picture is now complete, because historical pictures of this kind are never complete. The specific experience of the destroyer crews, as distinct from the U-boat commanders whose memoirs dominated the popular market, and from the strategic narrative that the big decisions and the famous turning points constitute, has been less thoroughly documented than the historical importance of the destroyer's contribution would seem to warrant. The men who wrote about it tended to write with the understatement that the service had inculcated in them. And the understatement is, for a reader who knows how to read it, full of information, but it requires a kind of reading chapter 17. What the ocean took, and what it gave, completion, that the culture of understatement does not always make easy. A man who writes that a particularly difficult convoy crossing was rather unpleasant at times is, if you know what the convoy losses were that week, telling you something specific and significant. The code requires a translator, and the translation requires time with the source material, and the time has not always been given. The result is that the human experience of the Atlantic destroyer crews has been somewhat overshadowed in popular memory by the more dramatic and more explicitly documented narratives of other theatres. The bombing of cities, the land campaigns, the set-piece battles that produce the kinds of images and statements that popular history most easily retains. The memorials that exist for the Battle of the Atlantic are, appropriately, concentrated in Liverpool and in the ports that were the operational centres of the campaign. The Atlantic Memorial at Derby House, the former headquarters of Western Approaches Command, commemorates the campaign in a building that was its operational nerve centre, and the experience of standing in those rooms where the charts were kept and the plots were maintained and the decisions were made that shaped the convoy routes is one of the more direct connections available between the present and the institutional reality of the campaign. The Tower Hill Memorial in London records the names of the merchant mariners lost at sea with no known grave, which is the majority of merchant mariners lost. The ocean itself, which received the ships and the men, and gave back only what it chose, is the memorial that has no inscription and requires no visiting, because it is always there, and it is always the same, and the specific patches of water where ships went down are neither marked nor markable, and are simply part of the ocean, which continues. The legacy of the Battle of the Atlantic, in strategic terms, is well established in the historical literature. Without the convoy routes, the supply of Britain could not have been maintained. Without the supply of Britain, the Allied presence in the European theatre could not have been built. Without the Allied presence in the European theatre, the campaigns that ended the war in Europe, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, the Normandy landings of the 6th of June, 1944, could not have been mounted. The connection is direct and it is real, and the men on the Atlantic destroyers who kept the convoys moving were, in the most literal sense, doing the work that made the rest of the war possible. This is not a rhetorical claim. It is a logistical fact, and it is worth stating as one, because the logistical facts of war tend to be less vivid than the tactical ones, and therefore less present in the popular memory, despite being more fundamentally determinative of the outcome. The ocean took from these men things that cannot be fully inventoried. It took the years of youth that were spent in a moving ship in a grey sea instead of wherever those years would otherwise have gone. It took, in many cases, health, the accumulated physical cost of sustained cold and broken sleep, and the specific stresses of naval service in hard conditions. It took, for those who did not come back, everything else. The futures they had been imagining, the ordinary lives they had been describing to each other in the mess, in the language of the imagined post-war world, the specific weight of a person in a specific place that the people left behind had to learn, slowly and not completely, to carry without them. The ocean is very large and very cold, and it holds no sentiment about any of this. That is simply what it took, catalogued without judgment, absorbed without acknowledgement. What it gave is harder to weigh on the same scale, but it was real. It gave, as noted, the specific self-knowledge that only the completion of genuinely difficult work can produce. It gave the particular quality of solidarity that forms among people who have endured the same hard thing together, a quality that survives the end of the specific context that produced it and is available thereafter as a different kind of companionship than anything civilian life generates by itself. It gave, to some of the men who experienced it, a permanent relationship with the sea. Not the romantic relationship of the coastal tourist, but the working relationship of a person for whom the ocean has been a place of daily serious consequence, and who cannot look at it afterwards without some residue of that seriousness remaining. And it gave, perhaps most lastingly of all, the knowledge that the job had been done, that the convoys had come through, that the supply lines had held, that the years of watchkeeping in the cold had added up to something that was real and visible in the shape of what came after. That knowledge belongs to the men who earned it, and it is not diminished by the passage of time, and it is not something the ocean could take back. Chapter 18. The last watch, there is a final accounting that every long story eventually demands, and this one is no different. We have followed the men of the Royal Navy's Atlantic destroyers across 18 chapters, and across nearly 6 years of a campaign that was, when it began, uncertain in its outcome and terrifying in its opening conditions, and that ended, not with a single dramatic event, but with a gradual, months-long easing of pressure. And then the specific date of the 8th of May, 1945, and then the strange, unrepeatable morning that followed. The last watch of the Atlantic War was not a dramatic watch. It was, for most of the men who kept it, a watch that felt like all the other watches, cold, attentive, long, until the news arrived, and then it felt like something that none of them had been prepared for, because nothing quite prepares a person for the end of the thing they have been doing for the whole of their adult life. The German submarine forces' formal surrender was organized in the days following the 8th of May. Grand Admiral Dönitz, commanding the remnant German government at that point, ordered all U-boats to surface and surrender to Allied forces, or to make for the nearest Allied port. The signal to the U-boats, which came at a time when more than 190 submarines were still at sea, was acknowledged and, in the majority of cases, obeyed. Some U-boat commanders, in the last days before the surrender, made decisions about their boats and their crews that the immediate post-war accounting would examine in some detail. The majority surfaced, flew the black flag of surrender, and were met by Allied escort vessels, destroyers and frigates and corvettes, whose crews had been hunting the same type of vessel for years, and who now found themselves alongside it in a context that was simultaneously familiar and entirely unprecedented. The accounts of what it was like to be on the deck of a destroyer, receiving a surrendering U-boat, are few but specific, and they describe an atmosphere that was not triumphant in any obvious sense. Quiet, professional, watchful, the understatement of the service finding its most complete expression in the moment when it had the most to express. The process of standing down from a war footing was, for the escort forces, a more complicated transition than the simple cessation of hostilities might suggest. Ships at sea needed to be brought into port. Equipment that had been at full operational readiness for years needed to be systematically stood down and stowed. The administrative machinery of demobilization, the release of the hostilities, only ratings, the reallocation of ships, the reassignment of officers had been planned in outline and now needed to be executed in detail in an organization that had been running at wartime pace for nearly 6 years, and that needed to change its operational rhythm without losing the institutional coherence that the wartime rhythm had been sustaining. The men who had been doing this work for years were simultaneously the people who needed to be released from it, and the transition required the organization to remake itself using the same people it was in the process of releasing. This is not a small administrative challenge. It was managed, and the management was imperfect in the ways that all large organizational transitions are imperfect, and the imperfections mattered to the individuals caught in them far more than the broader institutional narrative acknowledged. The hostilities, only ratings left the service in the months following the European surrender, processed through the demobilization machinery at a rate that the system could manage, issued with civilian suits and discharge papers and gratuities that acknowledged in formal financial terms the service that had been given. The suits were, by several accounts, not always well fitted. The gratuities were, by any comparison with what the service had actually required of the men over the previous years, not generous. The civilian world into which they were discharged had been changed by the war in ways they were already aware of and in ways they had not yet discovered, and the negotiation between the person the service had made them and the person the civilian world expected them to be was a negotiation that had no formal guidance and no institutional support, and was conducted entirely by the individuals themselves, with the help of whatever family and community they had to return to. Most of them managed it. The managing was not always smooth. The managing was real. The ships themselves followed their own trajectory into the post-war world. Some were retained in the reduced peacetime fleet, receiving the refits that the wartime pace had made impractical, and serving for further years in a navy that was reshaping itself for a different kind of strategic environment. Some were disposed of, sold for scrap, transferred to Allied navies, placed in reserve in anchorages, where they sat for years before the final decision about their fate was made. The town-class ships, those 50 aging American destroyers that had been transferred in 1940 and that had contributed to the Atlantic escort work with a reliability that their initial condition had not promised, were, for the most part, worn out by the end of the war and unsuitable for peacetime retention. They were broken up, and the steel that had been the hull through which Atlantic sailors had heard the sea on cold nights in 1941 and 42 was returned to the industrial process and became something else. This is the material fate of all ships, and it carries no particular sadness, but it is worth noting as a fact of the record. The institutional memory of the Atlantic campaign was kept in the post-war decades by the veterans' organizations, the naval histories, and the occasional public commemoration that the scale and duration of the campaign deserved, but did not always receive. The Battle of the Atlantic did not generate the same density of popular cultural attention as some other theatres of the Second World War. There were reasons for this. The campaign was long. It was predominantly at sea where cameras rarely went. Its decisive episodes were statistical rather than geographic. And the understatement of the men who had conducted it did not produce the kind of vivid personal testimony that popular memory most easily retains. The scholarship on the campaign improved markedly from the 1970s onward, when the declassification of intelligence materials allowed historians to reconstruct the full picture with a fidelity that the earlier histories, constrained by what could be published, had not been able to provide. Each subsequent generation of historians has found new things to say about the campaign, and the expectation that the next generation will find further new things seems reasonable. The Royal Naval Association and the various convoy and destroyer veterans groups held their reunions for decades after the war in the steady diminution that all veterans organizations experience as their members age and as the events that formed them recede into a past that fewer and fewer living people have direct access to. The last veterans of the Atlantic destroyer escort force are, as of the time of this documentary, at the very edge of the human span. The direct testimony is ending, not by dramatic cessation, but by the accumulation of the ordinary losses of time. What remains, and what will persist, is the documentary record, the deck logs, the operational reports, the intelligence assessments, the letters that were written on moving ships with cold hands, and that survived in family collections when the writers did not, and the memoirs, partial, understated, specific in the way that lived experience is always specific, that some of the men wrote down before the writing became impossible. The Atlantic Ocean itself continues. Indifferent to all of this, the weather systems that tracked eastward across it in the 1940s track across it still, generating the same sea states and the same cold temperatures and the same quality of grey light on a winter morning that the lookouts on the convoy escorts described in their letters. The water column, from the surface to the depths where the wrecked ships lie, maintains the same thermal layers that complicated the ASDIC operators' work. The biology of the ocean has changed in ways that the 1940s sailors would not have anticipated. The populations of the fish species that generated so many false ASDIC contacts are different now. But the acoustic environment of the deep ocean is recognizably continuous with what the operators heard in their headphones. The ocean has not memorized the campaign. It was not present at it in any sense that the word present can carry. It simply provided the medium, neutral, and enormous, through which the men conducted the longest continuous military campaign of the Second World War for nearly 6 years without ceasing. What this documentary has tried to do, from the first chapter to this one, is hold the human thread of that campaign steady against the background of the strategic and tactical narrative. The strategic narrative is important, and it is well documented, and the interested listener who wants to follow it into the full scholarship of the Atlantic War will find a literature that is substantial and still growing. What the scholarship does not always provide, and what the human record alone can provide, is the specific and irreplaceable texture of what it was actually like. The cold of the morning watch, the smell of the mess deck, the particular quality of the ASDIC operator's attention after 3 hours at the equipment, the cup of tea that was always strong, the hammock that swung to the rhythm of an ocean that did not care what year it was or what was happening in it. These things were the daily reality of the campaign for the men who conducted it, and they are worth preserving alongside the operational statistics and the strategic assessments, because they are where the human cost and the human achievement of the campaign actually lived. The men who served on the Royal Navy's Atlantic destroyers were not, for the most part, people who thought of themselves as making history. They were people doing a job, a hard job, in difficult conditions for a long time, because the job needed doing, and they were the ones assigned to do it. The modesty of this self-description is authentic rather than false, and it is one of the things that the record of their service most clearly conveys. They were right that the job needed doing. They were correct that they were the ones who did it. What they may not have fully appreciated, and what the perspective of 80 years allows us to see more clearly than they could from inside the experience, is that the way they did it, across 6 years of Atlantic service, with the steadiness and the professional competence and the accumulated endurance that the record documents, was not ordinary. It was, in the full meaning of a word they would not have used about themselves, extraordinary. And it is right that, in the quiet of tonight, wherever you are, and whatever this night holds for you, you have spent a few hours in their company. They deserved the attention. They still do. The convoy has come through. The watch is over. Sleep well.